Chapter 1745. Everything in this world seemed to be evolving in a beautiful direction. Apart from certain aspects. At this moment, the World King and the others had already followed Luo Fan to the world of Yang and arrived at the location of the Book of the Earth. As soon as they arrived, an indescribable wave suddenly swept across their bodies. It instantly sent chills down their spines as an indescribable sense of rejection rose from the bottom of their hearts. What is this? The World King thought to himself. With this thought in mind, he cast his gaze towards the source of the wave. At this moment, he saw that the wave came from the Supreme Emperors who had stayed in the world of Yang to observe the true divine body. However, at first glance, these Supreme Emperors seemed to be no different from normal people. However, upon closer inspection, one would discover that the light in their eyes was worlds apart from before. In the past, the light in their eyes was filled with boundless wisdom, endless profound thoughts, and profound truths. Just looking at them was enough to give anyone an indescribable understanding. It was enough for ordinary living beings to embark on the path of Tao and even cultivate to an unbelievable level. However, at this moment, the look in their eyes had completely changed. Now, their eyes were filled with emptiness and confusion, as if they were thinking about a problem that was completely beyond their understanding. It was as if their thoughts had completely disappeared and were now dying. In the face of such a Supreme Emperor, the World King's hair stood on end, and the terror in his heart became even more intense. "Wake up!" he bellowed, and an indescribable sound wave rushed out of his mouth and entered the ears of all the Supreme Emperors present, stimulating their souls in a frenzy. This sound wave, under normal circumstances, it was enough to evolve into countless worlds and space-time. If ordinary people heard this sound wave, in the blink of an eye, he would be drowned in the world created by the sound waves, unable to reincarnate for eternity. Under normal circumstances, ordinary Supreme Emperors should have instantly woken up when they heard this sound wave. However, at this moment, the many Supreme Emperors in front of him did not change at all because of the sound waves. Their eyes were still empty and blank, and they were still as dull as before. It was as if the sound wave had no power or power at all. What's wrong with them? Could it be? Is this the reason why fellow Taoist asked us to retreat just now? The World Emperor frowned as he looked at Luo Fan and asked. Luo Fan looked at them with an inquiring look on his face. "Perhaps," he said faintly. As for what they would develop and what changes they would undergo, the current him had no idea. When the mark changed, he recalled what had happened in the depths of his life essence, and instinctively felt that there would be serious consequences if he stayed here. However, he didn't know much about what would happen and how the imprint would work. Therefore, at this moment, the changes that happened to these Supreme Emperors were also completely foreign to him. This was his reply. Of course, it was impossible to satisfy the Realm Emperor. But since Luo Fan was unwilling to say more, the World Emperor did not ask much. In any case, he would know what was going on very soon. At this moment, the Supreme Emperor who had quarreled with Luo Fan earlier had a look of intense fear on his face. Although they didn't know what had happened to these Supreme Emperors, they could feel that what had happened to them was definitely not a good thing. At least, for these Supreme Emperors, it wasn't a good thing under such circumstances. They thought of their previous regrets and their quarrels with Luo Fan. How could they not be afraid? Just as everyone was feeling puzzled, the fluctuation that made everyone's hair stand on end suddenly began to increase rapidly. A strange feeling poured out from the fluctuation towards everyone. In the blink of an eye, the Supreme Emperors felt that the world in their eyes seemed to have undergone a subtle change. It was as if everything had suddenly become a combination of certain emotions. The universe of negative emotions. The other Supreme Emperors didn't know what it was, but Luo Fan saw it clearly. He couldn't help but have a complicated expression on his face. The changes in the world in front of him were clearly transforming into the universe of negative emotions. In other words, either this place was turning into the universe of negative emotions, or the passage to the universe of negative emotions had suddenly overlapped with this place. I see. After understanding this, he also understood what was happening to the Supreme Emperors at this moment. His heart thumped and he said to everyone, "Everyone, be careful." As he said that, his figure flickered, and with a light step, he had already left that place with the Book of the Earth. When he appeared again, he was already at a place that was unknown how many billions of light years away, standing in the void. Here, time and space had completely returned to normal. As for the Book of the Earth, it was still constantly absorbing the endless light that filled heaven and earth, transforming and strengthening itself. With their previous experience, how would the Supreme Emperors dare to neglect Luo Fan's suggestion? The moment they saw Luo Fan take action, they were all shocked. They hurriedly followed Luo Fan's example, leaping through the void and leaving that place. At the same time, they arrived near Luo Fan, hiding in a place that was unknown how many billions of light years away from where they were originally. The moment they left, countless explosions suddenly rang out from the bodies of the Supreme Emperors who remained in the same place. The sound of the explosion was so loud and shocking that it spread across the entire world. All the living creatures that survived in this world heard it in an instant. For a moment, almost all the living beings had a look of extreme fear on their faces. After all, these living beings didn't even know if the catastrophe of heaven and earth was over or not. To them, the fear that the catastrophe of heaven and earth brought them was simply too great. It was so great that they couldn't bear it. The reason why they were able to survive was because they were lucky enough. Under such circumstances, suddenly hearing the explosions that spread across the world, as if the entire world was collapsing, their first reaction was, of course, it was because the catastrophe that had caused them so much fear and brought them endless disasters had descended once again. As a result, it was completely normal for them to have this kind of look of fear. Just as the explosions rang out from the bodies of the Supreme Emperors, the aura of the universe of negative emotions around the space-time suddenly increased by who knew how many times. It reached the point where it didn't even need to be Luo Fan. Even the other Supreme Emperors could see the essence of it. How is this possible? How can negative emotions form such a powerful world? The Realm King exclaimed at this moment. Just as he was exclaiming, the structure of the universe of negative emotions began to rapidly collapse and fade. Not long after, everything returned to normal. It was as if the universe of negative emotions from before had never appeared. It's over. The Realm King frowned. It's over. The Realm King still didn't understand and murmured, "What the hell is going on?" The Realm King still didn't understand and murmured, "Those connate inextinguishable spiritual light have become ownerless," Luo Fan said faintly. The Realm King was slightly taken aback. Then, his expression changed drastically. His aura shook violently, even causing countless cracks to appear in the surrounding spacetime, forming countless tiny spacetime fragments around him. "They're already dead?" he said in disbelief. Supreme Emperors were existences that could not be killed in any sense of the word. Usually, other than Luo Fan easily killing hundreds of them with the help of the Seed of Chaos, all along, almost no Supreme Emperors had died. Even Supreme Emperors were so hard to kill. Those Level 3 Emperors had the protection of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Even in the state of chaos, it couldn't be easily destroyed. However, at this moment, right in front of them, Luo Fan actually said that in just a short period of time, those Level 3 Emperors were already dead. Even their innate inextinguishable spirit light had turned into ownerless inextinguishable spirit light. How could he not be shocked? Luo Fan let out a sigh. He took a step forward and his figure instantly crossed the spacetime. He directly came to that place. In this place, all the Supreme Martial Emperors had lost their lives one by one. Although their figures didn't change, even the power in their bodies didn't change much. However, anyone could tell that they were already dead with just one look. At this moment, the aura of the 5 connate inextinguishable spirit lights slowly grew and expanded, gradually devouring the bodies of the 5 supreme monarchs. The 5 supreme monarchs gradually lost their bodies, their power, and everything else. Those 5 supreme emperors were originally level 3 emperors. They were terrifying existences that could suppress all other supreme emperors in this world. Looking at them, who couldn't tell that they were already dead? At this moment, the other supreme emperors also arrived one after another. At this moment, their faces were filled with horror and indescribable panic. The concept of immortality of supreme emperors was the greatest reliance for these supreme emperors. If it wasn't for this, Luo Fan's act of easily wiping out so many supreme emperors wouldn't have shocked them so much, and they wouldn't have been so afraid of him. What did they discover at this moment? They discovered that the concept of immortality that they were so proud of was actually so fragile. It was so easy that they couldn't even understand it. They had already lost it. This kind of stimulation was enough to subvert their beliefs and make them feel at a loss. I want 2 of these connate inextinguishable spiritual lights, Luo Fan said directly. As he spoke, he pointed at 2 of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Puffed, puffed. After 2 explosions, the 2 supreme emperors trembled slightly and their bodies suddenly collapsed, turning into a cloud of smoke that spread in all directions. Immediately after, the power of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light within their bodies produced an indescribable attractive force that began to frantically absorb the smoke that the supreme emperors had turned into when they exploded. The smoke couldn't even form a large shockwave before it was sucked back by the attractive force and absorbed into the power of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. It directly constructed a passage that led to a mysterious place. Among the many level 3 emperors, Luo Fan was the only one who could transform the connate inextinguishable spiritual light into a halo and carry it around with him. The other level 3 emperors could only use various secret techniques to carry some of the power of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. The connate inextinguishable spiritual light itself was still stored in a special, hidden place. After all, with their control over the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, even though it was enough to move it, it required a lot of energy and a lot of time to do so. And in a battle, this was simply a fatal flaw. And now, Luo Fan used the bodies of these supreme sovereigns and their connection to the innate inextinguishable spirit aura to build a path to the innate inextinguishable spirit aura. His actions were like a signal, instantly waking everyone up as if they had just woken up from a dream. At first, their eyes were blank, but then, an indescribable excitement emerged from the depths of their eyes. Previously, they were just feeling sorry for the death of those supreme emperors, but they didn't think too much about it. Only after being reminded by Luo Fan did they react. The death of those supreme emperors was a great thing for them. Once a rank 3 emperor died, the innate inextinguishable spiritual light would become ownerless. This also meant that they would have the opportunity to possess the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. They had the opportunity to become third-grade martial emperors. They had the opportunity to never have to worry about anything in the upcoming Great Tribulation of the world. Normally, it would take them billions of trillions of years before they could even have the slightest hope of obtaining such a good thing. But now, the 5 innate inextinguishable spiritual lights were right in front of them, waiting for them to take them and seize them. The probability of obtaining them was more than 1 trillion times higher than before. For a moment, they all put aside the sadness they felt at the death of those supreme emperors. What they felt was an inexplicable excitement. They were also wary of the other supreme emperors. "You sure are in a good mood," the realm emperor sighed. However, he didn't stop Luo Fan's actions, nor did he refute his declaration. Although the 2 innate inextinguishable spiritual lights were extremely precious, Luo Fan's current strength was powerful enough to obtain certain privileges. Plus, it was because of Luo Fan's reminder that they were able to survive and avoid the fate of those supreme emperors. No matter what, they were indebted to Luo Fan. With these 2 points, not to mention 2 innate inextinguishable spiritual lights, even if there were 3, they could only endure it. Since even the realm emperor didn't object, the other supreme emperors didn't dare to say anything else. At that moment, they only looked at the other 3 innate inextinguishable spiritual lights, tacitly agreeing that Luo Fan would have the 2 innate inextinguishable spiritual light. Luo Fan wasn't surprised. After stabilizing the 2 innate inextinguishable spiritual lights, he said to Qing Yi and Yu Ji, "Choose one each." Hearing this, Qing Yi and Yu Ji were stunned at first, then indescribably pleasantly surprised. "This is really for us?" They couldn't believe it. "Of course, I already have 1 innate inextinguishable spiritual light. Why would I need another one? Who else would I give it to if not you?" Luo Fan said plainly. Hearing this, the other supreme emperors couldn't help but look at Qing Yi and Yu Ji with jealousy. The light in their eyes was almost tangible. How they wished they were Luo Fan's servants now. Qing Yi and Yu Ji couldn't help but tremble when they were stared at like this. They looked nervous too. This was the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, which represented eternal indestructibility and indestructibility. How could such an existence be given to lowly people like them? At this moment, they suddenly had a surreal feeling. They even wondered if they were dreaming. Cut the crap. Hurry up and choose. Every innate inextinguishable spiritual light is different, and the refining method is also very different. Your next task is to take the innate inextinguishable spiritual light you choose as soon as possible, Luo Fan said plainly. Hearing this, Qing Yi and Yu Ji seemed to wake up from a dream. Tears streamed down their faces as they kowtowed to Luo Fan. At the same time, they seemed to have made up their minds. Their eyes suddenly became extremely determined. Then, the 2 of them looked at each other. They each chose a passage and entered it. They each headed to the hiding place of the 2 innate inextinguishable spiritual lights and began to think of ways to refine the 2 innate inextinguishable spiritual light. Seeing them enter, Luo Fan casually dispersed the 2 passages. In an instant, Qing Yi and Yu Ji completely disappeared from the senses of all the supreme rulers except for Luo Fan. The locations of the innate inextinguishable spiritual lights hidden by the level 3 emperors. Naturally, they were extremely well hidden and could not be detected by any of the supreme rulers. Apart from Luo Fan, who could discover those 2 locations with the help of his senses when he was building the passages, the other supreme rulers would not be able to discover those locations unless they could completely comprehend the original arrangements of the level 3 emperors. This also ensured that Qing Yi and Yu Ji would have enough time and energy to refine the 2 innate inextinguishable spiritual lights. At that moment, Gui Shou, who was standing aside, only had regret on his face. There was no resentment. He could understand why Luo Fan gave the innate inextinguishable spiritual lights to Qing Yi and Yu Ji instead of him. After all, he had already fused so deeply with the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's brush that they were almost one. In this way, he could be said to have completely fused with heaven and earth. It made no difference to him whether he had the innate inextinguishable spiritual light or not. Even if he had the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, he would also be destroyed. It was impossible for him to hide in the innate inextinguishable spiritual light like Qing Yi and Yu Ji had done. In addition to that, even if he did not have the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, he could still use the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's brush to achieve all kinds of things as if he had the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. It was precisely because of this that he could become an unconventional level 3 emperor. Therefore, it was normal that Luo Fan did not give him the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. If he did, it would be a reckless waste of God's gift. This was the reason why he did not feel resentment. The reason why he felt regret. It was because he remembered that before the great calamity of heaven and earth, Luo Fan asked him to give up everything. The suggestion to reincarnate from scratch. At that time, he was reluctant to give up his own cultivation and his current achievements. He felt that after reincarnation, he would at most be like this, so he did not want to reincarnate. Now that he thought about it, he realized how big of an opportunity he had missed. If he had chosen to reincarnate, he would not be the Gui Shou who had fused deeply with the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's brush. He would be a completely new Gui Shou, without any shackles and completely free. If he had chosen to reincarnate, today's encounter would not have been like this. That innate, inextinguishable spiritual light must have had a part of him. This was the source of his regret and regret. However, what had been done, even if he regretted it now, the situation would not change. Gui Shou took a deep breath, and with great wisdom and perseverance, he brazenly cut off all kinds of distracting thoughts in his heart. Soon, his eyes became clear again. At this time, the Supreme Emperors did not do anything. Although each of them stared closely at the bodies of the remaining 3 Level 3 Emperors, they quietly watched the power of the 3 innate inextinguishable spiritual lights slowly devour their bodies. At this time, any one of them wanted to kill everyone else in an instant and monopolize an innate inextinguishable spiritual light. However, at this time, there were existences more powerful than them here, so they did not dare to do anything and could only wait for them to speak. I will not participate in these 3 spiritual lights. The World Emperor glanced at Luo Fan, sighed, and expressed his position. When the World Emperor spoke, a trace of joy flashed in the depths of the Supreme Emperor's eyes. If the World Emperor asked for 2 of the remaining 3 innate inextinguishable spiritual lights, they would not be able to resist. Now that he had given up, it was really for the best. At this time, there were still more than a dozen Level 3 Emperors left. Each of them just glanced at the innate inextinguishable spiritual lights, then shook their heads, indicating that they did not need these innate inextinguishable spiritual lights. Chapter 1746. As most of the Level 3 sovereigns expressed that they would not occupy the 3 innate inextinguishable spirit lights, the remaining Supreme Sovereigns' expressions changed. All of them looked a little wary. At this time, their focus had already shifted to the other Supreme Sovereigns present. Now, without the participation of the Level 3 Sovereigns, to them, their enemies had already become the remaining Supreme Sovereigns. Fellow Taoists, go ahead and fight, but don't destroy this heaven and earth, and don't harm each other's lives. The Realm King spoke at this time. After truly understanding how terrifying the great tribulation of the world was, the world monarch viewed the power of the world even more seriously than before. Now, to him, the more power of this heaven and earth could be preserved, the higher the chance of surviving the second great tribulation in the future. To him, this was a little more beneficial. Under such circumstances, he naturally did not want to see these Supreme Sovereigns lose too much because of this kind of battle. As for not destroying this heaven and earth, there was no need to say more. In order to protect this heaven and earth, he had spent so much effort and put in so much effort. Now that this heaven and earth was destroyed, wouldn't his efforts be in vain? How could he be willing to do that? Hearing the Realm King's words, the other Supreme Sovereigns did not feel the slightest bit disappointed. Instead, they were inexplicably excited. Although the Realm King's words were to limit the scale of their battle, on the other hand, this was also tacitly allowing them to fight. Agreeing to their original plan of using a battle to determine the ownership of the remaining 3 innate inextinguishable spirit lights. There were still dozens of Supreme Sovereigns here. Apart from the dozen or so Level 3 Sovereigns who did not participate, there were still 57 Supreme Sovereigns. Gui Shou was not included among them. In fact, Gui Shou's status in this heaven and earth was equivalent to that of a Level 3 Sovereign. Among the Level 3 Sovereigns who expressed that they would not participate in the battle, Gui Shou was included. However, there were only 3 innate inextinguishable spirit lights. Obviously, The probability of each supreme sovereign obtaining the inextinguishable spirit light was 3 out of 57. Under such circumstances, if they did not compete, there would be no hope at all. Those level 3 sovereigns saw the changes in their expressions and sighed. Then, they turned around and lifted their feet lightly. Their figures directly moved through the void and disappeared from this position. They headed in the direction of their original cave abode. In the end, only Guizhou, Luo Fan, and the other sovereigns were left. You should go too. Now that the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's Brush are transforming, it's time for you to reap the rewards. Don't be distracted, Luo Fan said to Guizhou. When Guizhou heard this, he quickly bowed to Luo Fan and said, "Yes." With that said, he didn't stay any longer. He turned around and stepped through the gap between yin and yang. He directly returned to the underworld and merged with his main body once again. At this moment, the underworld earth was also enveloped by the light that came after surviving the great calamity of the world. Within each spacetime, bits of inexplicable existences began to condense towards Guizhou's body, gradually condensing into a book and a pen in his heart. These were obviously the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's Brush. During the process of the book and the brush condensing, the silhouettes of the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's Brush above his head also became more and more real. It was as if they were gradually turning from illusory to real, from their original illusory state, gradually becoming a real entity. This appearance. It was obvious that the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's Brush were completing their transformation and were about to condense again. Just like the 3 books of heaven, earth, and man, they were about to become real again. Faced with such a situation, Guizhou wasn't as complacent as before. He just sighed and showed regret on his face again. While Guizhou was regretfully looking at the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's Brush, the endless spacetime in the underworld also gradually began to change. Each spacetime began to become stronger and more real. The destruction caused by the great calamity of the world was also rapidly recovering. Vaguely, there were countless yin souls and soul spirits being born out of thin air and being condensed. These newly born spirits and spirits were completely different from the spirits and spirits that were thrown into the underworld after the death of the living beings in the past. They were born without any memories or common sense. Even their intelligence was in the most primitive state. They could only slowly improve with the passage of time and the increase of their experiences. These souls were none other than the natives that had just been born in the underworld. Moreover, they were not created out of thin air. In fact, they were formed from the fragments of some living beings that had died in the great calamity of the world. Although they looked completely different from the living beings in the past, there was an extremely mysterious connection between them. It could also be considered another form of rebirth for those living beings. The appearance of this situation also represented another fact. The underworld was finally self-sufficient. It was finally complete. This also meant that the reincarnation cycle of this world had become even more profound and perfect than before. Guizhou could sense all the changes in the underworld earth. The regret in his heart gradually faded as the underworld gradually grew. Perhaps the connate inextinguishable spirit light isn't my Tao. A thought appeared in his mind. Perhaps my Tao is the underworld before me. Although compared to obtaining the connate inextinguishable spirit light, using the underworld as my Tao seems to be less safe, isn't it also more motivating? As he thought about that, an indescribable fighting spirit surged in his heart once again. His expression gradually became more lustrous. With this fighting spirit, the speed at which the Book of Life and Death and the underworld Judge's Brush condensed in his heart suddenly became faster. The speed at which the 2 artifacts materialized above his head also increased by quite a bit. The Book of Life and Death and the underworld Judge's Brush were existences that were close to chaotic origin spiritual treasures. Their profoundness could not be described with words. Naturally, they could not only change mechanically like other inanimate objects. The Gui Shou rejected them. They would naturally be affected, causing the speed at which they condensed to slow down. As the Gui Shou welcomed them, the speed at which they condensed would naturally increase when the Gui Shou left the Yang world. When he entered the underworld, Luo Fan only smiled faintly. Regardless of the Supreme Emperors, he took a light step and arrived at a spiritual mountain that was hundreds of millions of light years away from where he was originally. However, he did not come here to open up a cave abode and continue cultivating. The reason why he came here was that he planned to absorb the many false sages and desperators who had been absorbed into the connate inextinguishable spirit light in order to protect the power of this world. There was a world of difference in their numbers compared to before the calamity of the world broke out. Their losses were so great that anyone who saw it would be shocked. However, in reality, the current number was still quite considerable. They were a powerful force that had been rebuilt after the Great World Calamity and were also a reserve force for the next Great World Calamity. Such existences naturally could not stay in his connate inextinguishable spirit light forever. Instead, he needed to send them out and let them start absorbing the benefits that they had obtained after the Great World Calamity. He arrived at this spiritual mountain. After Luo Fan stood still, he had a thought. From the connate inextinguishable spirit light behind his head, rays of light rushed out and condensed into figures in the void in front of him. They were all fake saints and hopeless people. Their numbers were quite considerable, but at this moment, they densely filled the void in front of Luo Fan. They looked just like ants. After these false sages and desperators appeared, their bodies were bathed in the endless light that filled the world. This light had a strong soothing and healing power. It continuously seeped into the bodies of the many false sages and desperators present, allowing them to clearly feel that their bodies were constantly improving and their strength was constantly increasing. The various physical and mental injuries caused by the great tribulation of heaven and earth began to recover rapidly at this time. Vaguely, all kinds of indescribable enlightenment emerged in their hearts. This allowed their realms to gradually increase. After all, the connection between them, false sages and desperators, and this world was much stronger than that of the Supreme Emperors. This connection, although it made them suffer more directly from the impact of the Great World Calamity, the degree of damage they suffered was also greater during the process of the Great World Calamity. However, this also resulted in them obtaining much more benefits than the Supreme Emperors after the world survived the Great Calamity. To the Supreme Emperors, this inexplicable light that filled the world only made them feel relaxed and the pressure they endured during the Great World Calamity dissipated. The real benefits it brought were not much. However, to these false sages and desperators, this was a driving force to improve their realms. It was a fundamental power that allowed them to constantly feel that their strength was rising. At this moment, countless false sages broke through the gap between false sages and desperators because they had comprehended some key points, directly stepping into the desperation realm. Under this change, this spiritual mountain-surpassing realm suffered an impact that was difficult to form. This impact was so powerful and terrifying that it directly caused the spiritual mountain-surpassing realm to distort, and it was about to be completely flattened. If not for the fact that the world was still filled with that indescribable light that was constantly repairing everything, this spiritual mountain-surpassing realm might have already been completely flattened or even turned into a basin. Waves of strange light that erupted from these false sages soared into the sky, faintly shaking the laws of heaven and earth. It was deeply engraved on the great Tao of heaven and earth, causing the world to be filled with all kinds of faint multicolored light apart from the inexplicable light that was born from passing the Great World Calamity. This multicolored light represented the breakthrough of the false sages. In the past, it should have been so bright that it was dazzling. It should have even made the living beings within an unknown number of light years feel a sense of joy that came from the bottom of their hearts. However, at this moment, under the illumination of the light that filled the world, this multicolored light was almost completely covered. One could not even see it, let alone cause changes to the living beings within a large range. So many false sages had broken through. Quite a large number of desperators had also obtained a significant improvement at the same time. However, the desperators were much stronger than the false sages. If the same improvement was placed on the false sages, it would be enough for them to break through and step from the false sages to the desperators. However, if it was placed on the desperators, it would only be able to make their strength increase imperceptibly with the naked eye. Looking at this scene before him, Luo Fan was rather calm. He did not feel too much joy because of this, nor did he feel any strong regret because those desperators did not have an obvious improvement. He just stood there quietly and looked at them. In his hand, he was holding the Earth Book that was constantly improving and strengthening. The improvement of this world after the Great World Calamity lasted for a full 3 years. The improvement of the false sages and desperators also lasted for a full 3 years. 3 years later, more than half of the false sages had become Desperation Realm false sages. In other words, at this moment, the number of desperate sages in this world had already exceeded 50,000. As for those false sages, in addition, in the past 3 years, the living beings who were not false sages had broken through because of the benefits obtained from this world. The number had once again reached 100,000, although this was many times worse than before the Great World Calamity. However, it was already considered quite prosperous, and it was enough to satisfy people. Among the 100,000 false sages, those with connate Tao bodies, in other words, the false sages among the living beings created by Guizhou, accounted for 90% of them. The remaining 10% were the false sages that other living beings had broken through and become false sages. The situation of the despaired was similar. As many as 90% of the living beings with born Taoism aptitudes had become despaired. The remaining 10% were the desperators that other living beings had become desperators. In such a situation, they did not know the existence of this world. They could probably see clearly that those living beings with connate Tao bodies were the true protagonists of this world. They were the true protagonists of this world. After the light in this world gradually extinguished, Luo Fan raised his eyes and looked at the many desperate sages and false sages. There was a probing glint in his eyes, and he instantly saw the situation of all the living beings here clearly. This made the many false sages clearly feel an indescribable gaze sweeping across their bodies at this moment. An indescribable majesty made all of them feel inexplicably uneasy. Although they had just obtained a huge breakthrough and their strength was much stronger than before, all the complacency that they had felt because of this instantly disappeared because of this majesty. All of them had nervous expressions on their faces. Everyone, I believe you already know the general situation. Take care of yourselves from now on, Luo Fan said calmly. He had nothing to say to these false sages and desperate sages. Among these false sages and desperate sages, each of them had their own thoughts, their own cultivation path, and their code of conduct was different. For such existences, even for the same goal, there would definitely be many differences in their final methods of doing things, and they might even conflict with each other. Even Luo Fan could not completely suppress them. What they wanted to do in the end and what they would do in the end depended on themselves. No matter how much Luo Fan said at this time, it would be useless. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan said something just now. After witnessing the terror of the great tribulation of heaven and earth, the many false sages and desperate sages could naturally see the general situation of the world. For a moment, all of them had inexplicable expressions on their faces. Some were shocked, some were afraid, some were indignant, and some were happy. There were all kinds of emotions. Looking at their expressions, Luo Fan knew that his guess was right. They really had their own thoughts and goals. The many false sages and desperate sages did not sink into their own thoughts for too long. Very soon, they bowed to Luo Fan one by one, thanking him for saving their lives. Luo Fan did not say much. With a wave of his hand, he sent them away. False sages and desperate sages. In the current world, they were already considered extremely high-level existences. When they gathered together, they had already transformed the spirited mountain-surpassing region into an incomparably mystical paradise. The multicolored light that soared into the sky seemed to be made of multicolored light. After being sent away by Luofan, they turned into indescribable rays of light and headed to various places in the world. Although there were hundreds of thousands of false sages and desperate sages here, compared to the boundless world in front of them, this number was still extremely insignificant. They scattered, like a drop of water falling into a boundless ocean, almost impossible to find. After 3 years of development, the world was more than 100 times stronger than it was before the tribulation. It was not that its volume had increased by 100 times. In fact, the volume of this world had not only not increased, but it had also shrunk slightly. What was truly strong in this world was the strength of the world, the stability of the space, the stability of time, the amount and depth of the true sage mysteries contained in the great Tao, the inexplicable degree of mystery, and so on. This kind of improvement. As a result, the power of the false saint in this world was many times stronger than before compared to the improvement of the world itself. Nearly 99% of it had been lost previously. The many living beings also rapidly multiplied and grew rapidly in the past 3 years. Although there was still a world of difference compared to before the Great Tribulation, it was no longer as depressed as when the Great Tribulation had just passed. The entire civilized country had now been scattered into billions of tiny parts, each of them developing independently, gradually evolving into various completely different but equally mysterious and incredible civilizations. Of course, it was only 3 years after all. All of this development was still in its embryonic form. Under such circumstances, the many false sages and desperations spread out. The act of opening cave abodes and occupying territory in various parts of the world. However, it allowed their Tao of cultivation to gradually seep into all aspects of that part of the world, and even began to gradually affect the civilized country, causing the development of that part of the civilized country to start moving closer to the false sages in desperation. Luofan did not care much about these now. Compared to the various changes in the civilized country and the world, he was more concerned about the situation of the Earth Book in his hand. After the improvement of the Earth Book, it had undergone a huge change compared to before. Originally, it was already an important support of the reincarnation of this world. Now, it had become an indispensable part of it, vaguely having an indescribable connection with the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's Brush. Vaguely, it seemed to be able to affect the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's Brush. Of course, the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's Brush also seemed to be able to affect it. As for the various powers that it originally possessed, not only had they deepened, but they had also undergone an inexplicable change. Luofan had already completely refined it. Although he did not completely fuse with it, he could already sense many things through the Earth Book. For example, the inexplicable mysteries of the reincarnation of this world. For example, the great Tao of this world that was connected to the Earth Book. All these sensations made him feel that his understanding of heaven and earth was deepening at every moment. He could sense the existence of all kinds of secrets in this world. Through this feeling, he discovered that his view of the world had faintly been touched. The world formed by his life source had undergone a subtle growth. The various details had become more and more complicated, more and more real, and the changes had become smoother during these 3 years. The world wasn't exactly flourishing. In fact, at almost every moment, Luofan could sense all kinds of inexplicable vibrations and indescribable fluctuations constantly spreading from somewhere in the world and invading in all directions. This caused the laws of the world and the great Tao of this world to constantly undergo all kinds of inexplicable changes. According to the potential of these vibrations, if it wasn't for the fact that the vibrations seemed to have some kind of suppression effect, this world might have already fallen into chaos hundreds of times. Chapter 1747. 3 connate inextinguishable spiritual lights and 57 supreme emperors. It went without saying how intense the fight was. Fortunately, the supreme emperors remembered the realm emperor's words and tried their best to restrain the aftermath of the fight to minimize the damage to the world. That was why, even though the battle was so intense and the commotion spread throughout the world did not suffer too much damage because of it. Among the 57 supreme emperors, most of them were level 1 supreme emperors, which meant that they were ordinary supreme emperors. Only a small number of them were level 2 supreme emperors. The reason was simple. The weaker the supreme emperor was, the more cautious they were because they had a clearer understanding of their own strength. When Luo Fan told them to retreat, they carried it out more thoroughly. Therefore, the possibility of them escaping was naturally higher. The remaining 57 supreme emperors were the ones who had listened to Luo Fan's warning and left the world of Yang to not look at the true divine body. That was why there was such a structure. However, even though most of the supreme emperors were ordinary supreme emperors, there were still more than a dozen level 2 supreme emperors. This was also several times more than the 3 connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Therefore, they couldn't do what Luo Fan had done previously and rely on their own strength to split the 3 connate inextinguishable spiritual light. However, the fight didn't stop because of that. On the contrary, it was precisely because of this that the battle became even more complicated and intense. The ordinary supreme emperors had already joined the level 2 supreme emperors and helped the level 2 supreme emperors fight for the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, in exchange for the benefits that the level 2 supreme emperors would give them after they succeeded. In this way, the battle would no longer be a small-scale battle between a single person. Instead, it became a large-scale war, one that was far more complicated than a war between ordinary supreme emperors by who knew how many times, schemes. There were all kinds of tricks, and the art of war was displayed. If living beings who were interested in war watched it, they might be able to get inspiration and write countless books on war. However, this was nothing to Luo Fan. At this moment, he looked around and did not choose a new place. With a thought, the power of the Netherworld book surged, instantly constructing a mysterious, perfect, and powerful space-time. This space-time wasn't huge, but its level was extremely high. It wasn't something that an ordinary great thousand world could compare to. In fact, the moment it was born, the space-time naturally condensed some pseudo-sage level existences. Luo Fan opened up such a space-time. Of course, he was going to use it as his own cave dwelling. As for the sacred mountain and the palace in the center of the civilized country, they had been completely destroyed in the great calamity of the world. By now, the place had completely turned into ruins. If Luo Fan wanted to set up his cave abode there, he would need to open it up again and rebuild it. The amount of effort it would take would be no less than picking a random spot. Since the sacred mountain didn't have any special meaning and was nothing, he naturally couldn't be bothered to go back there to open up his cave abode. As for the 30 million great thousand worlds on the sacred mountain, they had already been completely destroyed in the great calamity of the world. The connection between Qing Yi and Yu Ji with the 30 million great thousand worlds had long been severed. However, they were no longer restricted by those worlds. They were no longer affected by those worlds. The great calamity of the world could even completely destroy a perfect world. Naturally, it was even more so. Although the 30 million great thousand worlds were created by Qing Yi and Yu Ji, the living beings in them were also created by them. Usually, they had a close relationship with them. If they were destroyed, it would have a great impact on them. However, in the great calamity of the world, this impact had already been covered by the even more terrifying evil aura of the great calamity, and it was no longer effective. Naturally, it could no longer affect them. Even this special thing had disappeared, so the location of the sacred mountain was naturally meaningless to Luo Fan. Stepping into the cave abode, Luo Fan's heart moved. The natural indestructible spiritual light behind his head trembled slightly and unfolded. It turned into a long river that spanned across the entire spacetime, almost filling up the entire spacetime. After the long river was formed, the false saint-level existence that was about to be born in this spacetime trembled slightly and lost all possibility of condensing and taking shape. This caused the spacetime to return to the purity when it was first created. After unfolding the natural indestructible spiritual light, Luo Fan didn't hesitate. With a light step, he had already stepped into the natural indestructible spiritual light and arrived at the location of the clone, which was also where the seed of chaos was. When he arrived here, an inexplicable feeling of relaxation appeared in Luo Fan's heart. It was as if he had only been able to escape from the shroud of some inexplicable power after arriving here. There's indeed still an inexplicable feeling on me. After discovering this, Luo Fan's heart trembled and his expression became extremely ugly. Back then, he felt that the way the saint's imprint left him was too straightforward and too smooth. It was so straightforward and smooth that he felt that it was a little unreal. Therefore, at that time, he had a faint suspicion that the true saint's imprint might have some inexplicable way left on his body. There might not be many of these inexplicable ways, and the impact might not be too great. However, once it was unleashed, it would definitely be enough to cause an extremely serious impact on him and bring about shocking destruction. However, although he knew this at that time, he knew that he couldn't get rid of these inexplicable ways with his own strength. Only when the time was right and he arrived at a place where even the true saint couldn't act recklessly would he be able to get rid of these inexplicable ways and truly regain his freedom. It was precisely because of this that he came here at this time. Sure enough, it was emitted with the help of the chaotic seed. The dense chaotic aura had driven away some kind of existence that he couldn't understand at all, which made his heart feel inexplicably relaxed. That's the saint's imprint. It must have been left behind by the true saint from another perfect world or even a great world. It seems to be different from the other saints' imprints. Obviously, there's something behind it. That's a backup. Perhaps it's resurrection? Luo Fan pondered in his heart. Although he didn't show it before, he was filled with shock when he saw the many supreme emperors, including the 5 third-grade emperors, silently lose their souls, lose their lives, and disappear from this world. Although the strength of those third-grade emperors might not be comparable to Luo Fan, in this world, they could be called invincible existences. Such existences. Even if he was determined to destroy this part of the world, there was still a possibility of that happening. However, such existences had lost their lives after looking at the figure that the saint's imprint had evolved for a short while and directly disappeared from this world. This situation, no matter how he looked at it, was unbelievable, and it was hard to understand. The universe of negative emotions. What kind of existence is that? Such thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind. As such thoughts flashed through his mind, the 2 cultivation methods that the true saint imprint had left in his heart resurfaced. These 2 cultivation methods were extremely complicated and mysterious. Even though Luo Fan was already standing at the peak of the true saint realm, he still couldn't understand the mysteries of these 2 cultivation methods. It seemed that as long as he kept moving forward, he could enter the true saint realm. At this time, he actually couldn't understand the mysteries of these 2 cultivation methods. In the end, no matter how many times he looked at them, he could only understand the cultivation goals of these 2 cultivation methods at most. Among them, the first one was the way to enter the universe of negative emotions. The other was to transform his body into a figure with 3 arms and 6 fingers on each palm. That was another way to seek the way, recalling the process of the disappearance of the previous supreme emperors. He combined it with the cultivation method in front of him. Luo Fan knew that their disappearance. It was very likely that they had cultivated this cultivation method to enter the universe of negative emotions. Although he didn't know the origin of the universe of negative emotions, he didn't know what form it was. However, according to the description of this cultivation method, the universe of negative emotions was a place with no tribulations and no limits. Compared to the world in front of him, which still had 8 terrifying tribulations, it could really be regarded as a wonderful place. However, just this alone is not enough to make those supreme emperors abandon everything in this world and step into that world, Luo Fan thought as his heart turned. Stepping into the universe of negative emotions was entering a brand new place with no tribulations and no limit. It seemed that he could live forever, and he didn't have to worry about when he would die. However, it was, after all, a completely unfamiliar place, and the dangers that might appear were unknown. Even an ordinary person, who didn't have any property, would have to think carefully if he wanted to abandon everything and step into that world. Not to mention those who had the innate inextinguishable spirit light, and could even rely on the innate inextinguishable spirit light to become eternal and indestructible. Just the situation of the universe of negative emotions was not enough for them to abandon everything and step into that world. With this thought in mind, Luo Fan began to carefully comprehend the cultivation method. He wanted to find the secret within, to find the reason why the supreme emperors were so desperate to enter the universe of negative emotions. Time flew, and in the blink of an eye, 100 years had passed. On this day, Luo Fan's heart trembled, and countless rays of light flashed on his body. At the same time, the clone in front of him quickly activated the seed of chaos, leading the endless chaotic state, which crazily rushed towards Luo Fan. In the blink of an eye, the chaotic state directly submerged Luo Fan's body, and it began to quickly melt his body, melting everything on him. There was no time in the chaotic state, but there was also an infinite amount of time. After an unknown amount of time, perhaps it was an instant, or perhaps it was hundreds of trillions of years, Luo Fan's entire body completely collapsed, leaving only the essence of life that had turned into the worldview of laws, resisting the invasion of the chaotic state with great difficulty. During this process, the aura of a negative emotion emerged on the worldview of laws, and it began to resist the invasion of the chaotic state. Although the aura of the negative emotion was only a little bit, it was actually of a very high level. The chaotic state could erase everything, and its intensity had even reached the point where just a little fluctuation was enough to completely erase the memories of the supreme emperors. However, in the face of the aura of the negative emotion, it actually didn't have much of an advantage. It actually quickly annihilated the chaotic aura. Neither could suppress the other, and they both gradually disappeared in the end. At the moment when the last wisp of the negative emotion completely disappeared, the chaotic state collapsed with a loud bang, completely turning into 4 basic existences that gradually melted into the surroundings, causing all kinds of strange things to appear in the surroundings. Then, they gradually disappeared, and the original appearance was restored. Only Luo Fan's origin of life, which had turned into the worldview of laws, was left behind, and it began to quickly derive his body from that position. At Luo Fan's level, everything in the body and mind. They were all existences that could be created and destroyed at will. Since the origin of life existed, it would be extremely easy to create a body and mind. Therefore, very quickly, Luo Fan's mind, body, and everything else was reborn. Moreover, compared to before, the degree of integration of this body and the worldview of laws had once again strengthened. The feeling of being completely different from everything around him became more and more obvious. After recovering, Luo Fan didn't do anything else first. He casually made a grabbing motion, and the copper mirror formed from the innate inextinguishable spiritual light instantly spun from where his clone was to the top of his head. Then, the copper mirror emitted a ray of light, condensing into an extremely mysterious machete in the void. It seemed to be extremely illusory, but also seemed to be absolutely real. It brazenly chopped down towards him. When this machete chopped down on his body, it didn't seem to touch anything. It brazenly drilled into his head, and went straight into the depths of his body and mind. It directly poured into his origin of life, his mind, and even his everything, directly destroying some inexplicable existence within. The machete condensed from the copper mirror continued to chop at his body. In the end, it finally dissipated after a total of 129,600 slashes. At this moment, Luo Fan let out a long breath, a look of lingering fear on his face. Such a thought flashed in his mind. No wonder they abandoned everything and directly threw themselves into the universe of negative emotions. Just now, the machete that he condensed with the help of the primordial origin spiritual treasure was none other than the wisdom blade that had condensed the strongest power of the primordial origin spiritual treasure. The only use of this wisdom blade was to erase his memories, to destroy some existence that was attached to his memories. And what he had consecutively chopped his body 129,600 times just now was the 2 cultivation techniques that he had obtained from the sage's mark. The reason for this was that when he was comprehending the cultivation method just now, the cultivation method actually came to life without him realizing it. It began to change in his memories, gradually taking control of his memories and his mind. Unknowingly, he began to cultivate the cultivation method and began to gradually change the state of existence of his body. It wanted to open the door to the universe of negative emotions and gradually immerse himself in it. If it wasn't for the fact that his origin of life, which had transformed into the world of laws, had not been touched at the last moment and had regained some clarity due to the challenge of this cultivation technique, allowing him to directly use the power of the seed of chaos to offset his cultivation, he might have followed in the footsteps of those supreme emperors and directly thrown himself into the universe of negative emotions. At this point, how could Luo Fan still not understand why those supreme emperors would not hesitate to throw themselves into the universe of negative emotions? Even Luo Fan had almost thrown himself into it, let alone the other supreme emperors who had not even sorted out their own unique worldview. How could they possibly withstand the manipulation of the cultivation technique? It was because Luo Fan realized just how strange this cultivation method was that after he recovered, he didn't hesitate to use the power of the primordial essence spirit treasure to directly destroy all of his memories of this cultivation method, completely cutting off all traces of it. Fortunately, the primordial spiritual treasure that had evolved from the inextinguishable spiritual light could possess such incredible power, which allowed Luo Fan to completely destroy the 2 cultivation technique. If he was just a little bit slower, the cultivation technique might have been reborn in his mind by now. He carefully searched through his memories and his mind. After sensing that there was no longer any trace of the 2 cultivation techniques, and that even he had completely forgotten the specific details of the 2 cultivation techniques, Luo Fan finally felt relieved. If this was the case, the 2 cultivation techniques could still be reborn. Then he would accept it. True divine. True divine. I didn't expect that just a mark would be so terrifying. After relaxing, an inexplicable and complicated feeling made Luo Fan sigh with emotion. Back then, was it the will of heaven and earth that communicated with the true divine, or was it another true divine? What was its intention? With a thought, this question emerged in Luo Fan's mind once again. Back then, the existence in the form of the true divine that the sage's mark had transformed into was obviously communicating with some kind of existence. However, the voice of that communication contained mysteries. It was far beyond the limit that Luo Fan could bear. That was why when he heard the voice, he could only think that it was thunder, and he had no idea what it was saying. At that time, obviously, there was another voice that responded to his voice. The other voice that responded was also mysterious beyond the limit of his understanding, and he also heard it like thunder. It was precisely because of this that it could be predicted that the existence was obviously on the same level as the true divine, or it was another true divine. Or it was the will of heaven and earth. Just as he was thinking to himself, the thunder that he had heard in the underworld seemed to resound again. It kept reverberating in his mind. No, it was not seemed. Instead, the voice had indeed reverberated again. However, the voice did not appear in reality, and it did not pour into his ears. Instead, it directly appeared in his mind and reverberated in his mind. As the voice reverberated in the air, mysterious characters and runes began to appear in his mind. This is... Luo Fan sensed the various characters and runes that appeared because of the reverberation of the voice, and he felt an inexplicable sense of doubt. After those characters and runes appeared, it was like a mountain torrent had broken out. It started to pile up crazily, and in an instant it completely filled his mind. This is... those two cultivation techniques. Suddenly, Luo Fan came to a sudden realization. An extremely shocked expression appeared on his face. The many characters and runes had impressively formed two cultivation techniques. One was to change the nature of living beings, opening the passage to the universe of negative emotions, and stepping into the universe of negative emotions. The other was to transform living beings into a completely different form, a completely different nature of existence. Although Luo Fan had already erased all his memories of those two cultivation techniques, he did not feel any sense of familiarity when looking at them now. He did not know if these two cultivation techniques were exactly the same as the previous two. However, with just a little bit of logical reasoning, how could he not know that these two cultivation techniques were the same? After discovering this, how could he dare to be negligent? He quickly summoned the bronze mirror-like primordial origin spiritual treasure and activated its power once again. A sharp blade of wisdom condensed in front of him, and it slashed straight at him. It cut straight into every part of his body, penetrated deep into his mind, and cut at the roots of those two cultivation techniques. Every slash seemed to instantly destroy a perfect part of the world, causing a perfect part of the world to completely collapse and disappear. In Luo Fan's mind, it was as if his own mind had been destroyed and rebuilt once again. The horror of this was self-evident. This time, Luo Fan made a total of 12,960,000 slashes before he finally completely destroyed the two cultivation techniques, completely erasing all his memories related to these two cultivation techniques. Then, he did not stop. Instead, he continued to wave the sharp blade of wisdom and continued to slash at his mind and body. His target was the thunderous sound that he had heard when the true divine spoke. Chapter 1748. The sound of thunder was different from the two cultivation technique. It was the language of a true saint, and it contained a mysterious existence that Luo Fan could not understand at all. Although it was not as mysterious as the mark of a saint, which could produce all kinds of mysterious effects in the origin of life, it was still unusual. However, he also felt that it was unusual. In Luo Fan's heart, it was incomparably powerful and incomparably stubborn. If he wanted to destroy it, he would have to pay a price that was thousands of times greater than the price he had to pay to destroy the two cultivation techniques. At this moment, Luo Fan controlled the sharp blade of wisdom to continuously slash at his body, his soul, his memories, and constantly bombarded the sound of the true saint's words. Just like that, Luo Fan slashed for several days, and the number of slashes he made could even be counted in the hundreds of millions. In the end, the source of the rumbling was destroyed amidst an indescribable rumble, causing him to feel an indescribable sense of relief. That strange rumble did not just ring out in his heart, but directly spread out. It even caused the space in front of him, which he treated as his cave abode, to tremble violently. Even the world outside the cave abode was filled with strange rumbles. Yes, the hearts of the supreme sovereigns who were fighting for the three connate indestructible spiritual lights in the distance trembled, and they vaguely felt that they had suddenly become clear-headed. However, this sobriety only lasted for a short while. Very soon, they once again fell into the frenzy of battle due to their current situation. They completely forgot about everything in the outside world and started to continue fighting and fighting. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was inside the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, felt as if all the shackles had been removed. His entire body, both inside and outside, everything was relaxed. Even the space-time that was formed by his origin of life seemed to have become much more crystal clear at this moment. At this moment, it seemed to have become much more crystal clear, and everything within it seemed to have become more and more perfect. The gap between him and a perfect world had narrowed a little. This situation meant that his world view of laws had improved. Although it had not reached the level of a truly perfect world that could support him to exist freely in the state of chaos, he had faintly touched the edge. I didn't expect that at this time everything about a true saint would be destroyed. To me, it's actually a burden. An indescribable realization surfaced in his heart. With this enlightenment, the true sage mystical abilities that he had obtained appeared in his mind, as well as the form of the primordial essence spirit treasure. All these thoughts surfaced in his mind, and he couldn't help but show some struggle in his eyes. The true divine ability had brought him huge benefits back then, allowing his strength to increase greatly. In the end, he was able to participate in a battle between false sages before he even reached the false sage stage. Although the body of the primordial origin spirit treasure was not as useful as the true divine spell, it had an extremely mysterious connection with the true divine spell, causing the two to fuse together. Their power had increased tremendously. Moreover, these two things did not only bring him benefits in the beginning. Even now, it was a great revelation to him. It was enough for him to feel more and more of the mysteries that belonged to a true divine. He could vaguely dig out many truths that he needed to understand. Under such circumstances, he would naturally hesitate about what he was going to do next. However, in the end, Luo Fan still made up his mind. A look of determination appeared on his face. They have already become my obstacles. This thought appeared in his heart with incomparable determination. With this thought, without hesitation, he controlled the sharp blade of wisdom that had yet to disappear and slashed it into his body. It slashed into his body, and even into his life source. It slashed towards all traces of the true divine ability and the form of the primordial essence, spirit treasure. Crack, 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 strange sounds kept coming from Luofan's body. This sound was so wonderful. Although it wasn't as wonderful as when the roar had been slashed, it didn't even shake the outside world and affect the thoughts of all the supreme emperors in the world. However, it was also constantly being transmitted and reverberated within the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. It made all the living beings within the connate inextinguishable spiritual light clearly realize that some incredible changes were about to occur outside the world, and the impact of this change to them would definitely be incomparably huge and shocking. For a moment it was unknown how many living beings were worshipping the sky. All of them were extremely pious and looking forward to it, waiting for it. Luo Fan didn't care about anything that was happening in the outside world at all. At this moment, his entire body and mind were immersed in the sharp blade of wisdom. He carefully sensed the subtle changes that the blade of wisdom brought to his body and mind. Every slash from the sharp blade of wisdom brought him some damage. There was no doubt about this, however. With every slash, he felt that his mind seemed to be a little clearer. It was as if he had comprehended something from this slash that he should have comprehended, but it had been concealed by something. As this situation progressed, Luo Fan became more and more determined about his actions. In his heart, he became more and more convinced that his choice was correct. Completely destroying the traces of the true divine theurgy and the primordial origin spiritual treasure was the correct choice. In the blink of an eye, 100 years had passed during this process. The number of slashes from the sharp blade of wisdom had even surpassed the limit of what could be described with numbers. Luo Fan was enduring the slashes of the sharp blade of wisdom almost every moment. Every moment, he felt all sorts of losses emerge, but at the same time, he also felt that he had gained something. Although it was only a theurgy and the form of the primordial origin spiritual treasure, don't forget when Luo Fan had obtained them. It was unknown how many millions or even hundreds of millions of years had passed since then. And during this period of time, Luo Fan's growth was the fastest and the greatest. As a result, it was self-evident how many things he had developed based on these two, and how many things were engraved with the traces of these two things. It had almost been implemented in all of his cultivation. Of course, it wasn't an easy task to completely destroy it and erase all traces of it. It took him 100 years. But that was still considered fast. After 100 years, the last blade of wisdom slashed into Luo Fan's heart. The moment the last trace of the theurgy and the form of the primordial origin spiritual treasure was destroyed, a strange sound of thunder came from his body. It instantly swept through the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, causing it to violently vibrate. An inexplicable attraction was produced from all areas of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, directly acting on Luo Fan's body. At the same time, there was an indescribable repulsive force produced from all areas of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, also acting on his body. This state was both attractive and repulsive at the same time. It was so contradictory but also so harmonious, giving people a feeling that this was how it should be. This kind of repulsive force and this kind of attraction should appear at the same time, acting on the same person. Luo Fan didn't know what this change in the connate inextinguishable spiritual light was, but he felt that his ability to control the connate inextinguishable spiritual light seemed to have increased by another step. Many things that he couldn't do with the connate inextinguishable spiritual light before, now seemed to be able to be done with it, so it's true. Realizing this point, Rinpoche's heart sank. An inexplicable smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. At this moment, he was much more relaxed and clear-headed than before. The way he thought about problems, compared to before, there seemed to be all sorts of indescribable changes. That worldview seemed to have been perfected in some way that couldn't be described with words. This kind of perfection brought the world of laws closer to his goal. Sure enough, all the existences that belong to true sages are all burdens and burdens to me now. Feeling the various changes in his worldview, Luo Fan had an indescribable realization in his heart. The path that he was walking on. It was originally different from the earth, the universe, and all the living beings in this world. For other living beings, the existence of true sages, even the most insignificant ones, had countless benefits for them. There were countless benefits for them, but for Luo Fan, those were obstacles instead. Instead, they were detours that had been opened up on the road that he had originally been aiming for. Other living beings could understand the existence of true sages, allowing them to continuously get closer to their goals and continuously walk towards the true sage level. However, for Luo Fan, this allowed him to walk further and further on the road to true sage level. There was no other reason other than a unique worldview. This was a cultivation method that started from the most fundamental nature of one's body and continued to improve and sublimate. Finally, it was promoted to the true sage level, so that the worldview could be perfected to the point that it could resist the invasion of the chaotic state and support everything in the chaotic state. Such a cultivation method itself required absolute autonomy, absolute independence, and absolute exclusion of all other worldviews from one's own worldview. The existence of true sage level itself had a worldview that completely belonged to that true sage. The imprint was so deep that even the current Luo Fan couldn't sense it. After absorbing such an existence, the impact on Luo Fan would definitely be extremely huge. The imprint that belonged to the true sage's worldview would definitely cause conflict with Luo Fan's worldview, causing his worldview to become impure. Although the worldview seemed to be constantly improving during this process, it would gradually lose the characteristics that originally belonged to Luo Fan. To Luo Fan, this was obviously a fatal hidden danger. As for whether this impact would have any effect on other cultivators, it was even simpler. Those cultivators didn't realize that they needed to sort out their own unique worldview. Under such circumstances, the only way for them to become true sages was to make their own worldview as compatible with the worldview of the outside world as much as possible and in line with the true sage's worldview. Under such circumstances, the more true sage imprints one absorbed and the more true sage's worldview one obtained, the higher the possibility of surpassing one's limits and becoming a true sage. Realizing this, an inexplicable joy appeared on Luo Fan's face. He looked at the sharp blade of wisdom. In his eyes, it was no longer the blade, but a path that led to the highest peak. Without hesitation, he controlled the sharp blade of wisdom and slashed it at him. Since he knew that the existence of the true sage level seemed to be useful to him now, it was actually harmful. How could he not know how to cultivate? At this time, what he needed to do was to completely cut off all the existence of the true sage that he had obtained over the years. Whether it was the mystery of the true sage, whether it was the mystery of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, he didn't intend to leave even half of it behind. The connate inextinguishable spiritual light. It was also an existence of the true sage level. Although it was different from the true sage, its own worldview was already deeply rooted. Unless it had already fused with Luo Fan from the beginning and was completely compatible with Luo Fan from the beginning, its worldview would definitely not be the same as Luo Fan's. Under such circumstances, the mystery of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light would definitely be included. It was a worldview that was incompatible with Luo Fan's worldview. This was obviously a hindrance to him right now. As for whether he could still control the connate inextinguishable spiritual light after cutting off all his understanding of it, Luo Fan wasn't worried at all. There were 3 realms in philosophy. A mountain was not a mountain, and a mountain was still a mountain. In the beginning, when Luo Fan didn't understand the connate inextinguishable spiritual light at all, he was still in the realm of seeing a mountain as a mountain. At that time, the connate inextinguishable spiritual light was a completely different entity to him. It was naturally impossible for him to control the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. After that, he started to comprehend the connate inextinguishable spiritual light and understood its mysteries. By absorbing it, he had stepped into the second realm, the realm of seeing a mountain as a mountain but not a mountain. At this realm, because he had already understood the mysteries of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, he had already deeply engraved his mark into the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Naturally, he could also control the connate inextinguishable spiritual light to a limited extent. After this, the realm of seeing a mountain was still a mountain. This was the realm that Luo Fan was stepping into at this moment. After stepping into the third realm, the realm of seeing a mountain was still a mountain. He seemed to be the same as the first realm. Everything he saw seemed to be exactly the same. However, in reality, the essence was already a world of difference. After stepping into this realm, although he still saw a mountain, however, his instincts had allowed him to understand the deeper principles of the mountain, and he could grasp the deeper mysteries of the mountain. In that case, his control over the connate inextinguishable spiritual light wouldn't weaken. On the contrary, it would greatly increase. This could be seen from the changes that occurred after he cut off the traces of the primordial spiritual treasure and the true divine mystic art. The previous attraction was because Luo Fan had seen a deeper level of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. The connate inextinguishable spiritual light was becoming closer to him. As for the rejection, it was because the mark between Luo Fan and the connate inextinguishable spiritual light had weakened before. It had already taken him 100 years to cut off the primordial spiritual treasure and the true divine mystic art. What he had to cut off next would be thousands of times more. The amount of time he would need to do so could be imagined. Ka, strange sounds were constantly emitting from Luo Fan's body. They constantly reverberated within the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, constantly affecting the creatures within it. However, compared to before, they had already experienced it once, after all. Furthermore, it had been far too long, so the living beings did not prostrate themselves devoutly like before. Instead, they only looked at the sky with reverence in their eyes from time to time. Time passed. 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years. Unknowingly, tens of millions of years had passed. In these tens of millions of years, earth-shattering changes had taken place in this world. Now, there were no longer any traces of the destruction caused by the great calamity of the world. The development of civilization in this world had unknowingly flourished to the point where it had even surpassed any world that Luo Fan had ever seen or heard before. In this world, the creatures with the connate Dao physique had already developed to every inch of the world. Now, almost every mountain, valley, hill, grassland, and inch of ocean in this world had traces of their activities. The number of false saints. Now, it was no longer the original 100,000, but had reached the level of nearly 100 million. Although the number of desperators wasn't as much as the number of false saints, it had nearly doubled. It had reached the level of nearly 100,000. In addition to the increase in the number of false saints and desperators, the number of supreme emperors had also increased. They had also improved. Now, the number of supreme emperors in this world had unknowingly increased by more than 200, returning to the scale of more than 300 supreme emperors before the great calamity of the world. Even though the vast majority of them were only ordinary supreme emperors, and their quality was much lower than before, it was only a matter of time before they were able to do so. It could be predicted that when this world faced the second great calamity of the world, the strength of the entire world would definitely be many times stronger than before the first great calamity of the world. As for the battle between the original 57 Supreme Emperors for the 3 connate inextinguishable spiritual lights, it had already ended millions of years ago. They were all first and second grade Supreme Emperors, so there might be a difference in strength. But in essence, the difference wouldn't be too big. Therefore, even though the battle had lasted for millions of years and the intensity of the battle had reached a state that made the desperators truly despair, in the end, not a single Supreme Emperor had died. At the very most, it was just that their bodies had exploded and their souls had turned into powder, unable to condense again for a long time. As for the 3 connate inextinguishable spiritual lights, in the end, none of the Supreme Emperors had occupied them. More than a dozen second-grade Supreme Emperors were similar in strength, and they were all difficult to kill. The end result was naturally an endless battle, with no one being able to suppress the other. Coupled with the fact that more and more desperators had become Supreme Emperors, the pressure on all of them had unknowingly increased. In the end, the Supreme Emperors had no choice but to stop fighting and first work together to comprehend the 3 connate inextinguishable spiritual light. In the end, they would use the method that Child Emperor and Country Emperor had set up to comprehend the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. They would see who could refine the connate inextinguishable spiritual lights in the end and become the owner of the connate inextinguishable spiritual lights. This situation was obviously to prevent the new Supreme Emperors from participating in the battle. Although the Supreme Emperors had their reservations during the millions of years of battle and didn't dare to go all out, limiting the scale of the battle to a level where it wouldn't destroy the world, but it was still a battle between Supreme Emperors after all. After spending so much time, they finally changed the space-time around the battlefield, which spanned an unknown number of light years. This caused various scenes that couldn't possibly exist in the outside world to appear in that spacetime. The nomological laws became completely different from the outside world. Even the laws of heaven and earth that corresponded to this spacetime were vaguely different from other places. The cultivation paths of the Supreme Emperors were deeply engraved in this area, causing an unknown number of spacetime to appear in this area. As a result, this place became a holy land and forbidden land for the countless cultivators in this world. It was called a holy land because they could sense the principles and mysteries of their cultivation paths in this spacetime. If they could cultivate and comprehend here, their cultivation speed would increase tremendously. Even their cultivation potential would increase tremendously. It was called a forbidden land because this place also contained principles and mysteries that were completely opposite to their cultivation paths. Some even completely targeted their cultivation paths. If they weren't careful and were corroded by these principles and mysteries that were completely opposite to their cultivation paths, not only would they be unable to improve their cultivation, but their cultivation might also be destroyed by this environment. They might even lose their lives here. It was precisely because of this that the area spanning an unknown number of light years had become so strange. Therefore, during the process of this world's development, the civilized countries had built special institutions in the surroundings. They had vaguely formed a set of conventional rules and a cultivation civilization that corresponded with them. They had developed a cultivation characteristic that was completely different from other areas. Chapter 1749. On this day, in the boundless space and time, a figure gradually materialized and gradually appeared. This person was a middle-aged man. He looked rather ordinary, but the light in his eyes seemed to be able to cover up everything. Even the light formed from the materialization of wisdom couldn't compare to that light. This person was the World Emperor. However, compared to before, his appearance had changed a little. He had become more natural, and his relationship with the surrounding world had become more harmonious. From this, it was obvious that he had also obtained countless benefits from the great calamity millions of years ago. Only now do I know what it means to change the world. Lifting his eyes, he swept his gaze across the entire world. All the scenes of spacetime in the heaven and earth region entered his eyes, causing him to feel inexplicably emotional. The amount of time he had existed in this world had even reached a realm that couldn't be described with numbers. However, before this world was truly perfected, even in the first tens of millions of years since Luo Fan stepped into this world, everything in this world had almost never changed. The living beings in it all had at least the strength of a false saint, and their lifespans were infinite. For such creatures, tens of millions of years or even hundreds of millions of years were merely the difference between a nap and a nap. In this situation, the flow of time naturally had very little effect on the world. Therefore, in the billions of years before Luo Fan's arrival, although there had been some changes in this world, they were just some details. The overall appearance and form of this world were not much different from when it was first created. The living beings that could be found back then would search for them billions of years later. Even if they couldn't find them anymore, they would definitely be able to find some traces. The mountain that could be found back then would be found billions of years later. At the very least, they would be able to see half of it in this situation. How could they feel the changes of the world? It was only at this time, when this world had truly been perfected, and the living beings with short lifespans began to exist in this world, the flow of time would reveal its incredible power. This was also why this world would undergo all sorts of incredible changes due to the changes of time. This was why there would be the effect of the changes of the world, in the tens of millions of years that seemed like a nap in the past. The realm emperor simply had too much to take in. The various developments of the civilized country, the various scenes of the cultivation civilization that had been born from it, and the various changes that living beings with connate Tao bodies had made to the world. Everything caused the world to completely change. It was as if the world had developed for billions of trillions of years instead of just tens of millions of years. With a thought, the will that he had placed on the heavenly book and the human book shook slightly. An inexplicable wave swept across the entire world. In the blink of an eye, he had already discovered the location of the 20 innate indestructible spiritual light. Among them were the 2 innate inextinguishable spiritual lights that Luo Fan had seized and given to Qing Yi and Yu Ji, as well as the fact that the owner of the innate inextinguishable spiritual lights had not been determined even after hundreds of years of battle. Instead, everyone had no choice but to compromise and fight for the 3 connate inextinguishable spirit lights together. All of them were absorbed into his senses. It seems that the 3 connate inextinguishable spiritual lights will still be troublesome in the future. Looking at the 3 connate inextinguishable spiritual lights, the Realm Emperor could not help but sigh. Although the world's great tribulation had already passed for tens of millions of years, the various changes within the world's great tribulation were still vivid in his mind. The various powerlessness he felt during the world's great tribulation still made him feel deep hatred at this moment. Over the years, he would occasionally think about it and doubt whether his decision back then was correct. Back then, he clearly knew that if the world was truly perfected, it would cause the world's great tribulation to descend. Yet, he just watched it happen and watched as the world was perfected. He did not stop it. Back then, he had thought that although the great tribulation of the heavens and earth was terrifying, the heavens and earth had accumulated so much power for so many years. Although the possibility of surviving the 9 great tribulations of the heavens and earth was extremely small, it still existed. Moreover, he was already a little tired of the world's constant changes, so he just sat back and watched everything happen. But now, it seemed that even the first world's great tribulation almost destroyed the world several times. In the end, he even relied on the true saint's unknown method to completely eliminate the subsequent world's great tribulation. How could he not know that he was wrong? How could he not know that his initial prediction was too optimistic? The possibility of passing through 9 worlds' great tribulation was countless times smaller than what he had expected. I must prepare early. Recalling his comprehension over the tens of millions of years, the Realm Emperor made up his mind. Then, he moved his heart and the 2 books of Celestial and Being slowly emerged from the great path that was in a deep sleep. After emerging, it directly appeared above the Realm Emperor's head. It seemed to be floating and sinking, revealing a supreme and mysterious charm. Although the Realm Emperor's control over the 2 books of Celestial and Being was only a tenth of that, his strength was after all the strongest in the world. However, his strength was at the highest level in the world after all. The toughness and firmness of his brand was not something that other supreme emperors could compare with. When Luo Fan didn't make a move, his ability to control the 2 books of Celestial and Being was not something that the other supreme emperors could resist. Under such circumstances, he could naturally control the 2 books of Celestial and Being to do some simple things that he wanted without the other supreme emperor's consent, of course. This kind of simple things was only relative to the power of the 2 books of Celestial and Being. In fact, the power that he could exert by controlling the 2 books was absolutely unbelievably powerful. At this moment, when the 2 books of Celestial and Being were above his head, the fluctuation that locked onto the connate inextinguishable spiritual light started to shake slightly. Indistinctly, there were invisible channels. Brazenly, these channels were built in the midst of these fluctuations. The 2 ends of these channels were where the connate inextinguishable spiritual light was. The other end was at this moment, right in front of the Realm Emperor. At this moment, right in front of the Realm Emperor. Fellow Taoist, what do you mean? At this moment, a voice suddenly came from all directions and bombarded the Realm Emperor like thunder. The Realm Emperor was very powerful. If he was doing other things, they naturally wouldn't dare to argue with him because they weren't strong enough. However, the situation now was different. Now, what the Realm Emperor was doing. He was clearly attacking the foundation of their cultivation, the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. This was already affecting their own cultivation path. How could they treat it like anything else? Even if they knew that they weren't strong enough, it was impossible for them to not fight back. I'm just building a true cultivation holy land so that the living beings in this world can have a greater chance of becoming supreme emperors, the Realm Emperor said faintly as he listened to the countless thunder sounds. At the same time, his control over the two books of celestial and being became more and more unyielding. The power of the two books began to leak out continuously. This end of the passageway began to gradually connect and fuse with the surrounding spacetime. Fellow Taoist, did you ask us? At this moment, figures appeared in front of the Realm Emperor. These figures, they were none other than the more than 20 level 3 emperors that still existed in this world. Except for Luo Fan, at this moment, the expressions of these level 3 emperors became extremely ugly. Their eyes were even about to spit out flames. These were the clones of these level 3 emperors. However, they weren't ordinary clones. They were terrifying clones that contained almost all of their strength, power, and strength. Such clones. The fact that they had appeared here meant that they were extremely furious. If the Realm Emperor gave a wrong answer, what would happen next would inevitably be a terrifying war that would spread across the entire world. Once the war broke out, they wouldn't care about whether this world would be destroyed or not. At that time, the destruction it caused would definitely be a myriad of times more terrifying than the scale of the battle between the 57 Supreme Emperors from before. Even if this world had already passed through the first tribulation and was many times stronger and more tenacious than before, it would still be difficult for it to remain intact in such a battle. Perhaps it would return to the time when the tribulation was still happening. At this moment, the Realm Emperor looked at everyone with a faint smile on his face and said, "If I ask fellow Taoists, you definitely won't agree. So, I can only act first and report later. I hope fellow Taoists can forgive me." Hearing this, the level 3 emperors were about to explode. It seems that fellow Taoist now thinks that you can easily suppress all of us. Since that's the case, let's show you our progress. A level 3 emperor said coldly. As he spoke, his aura began to rise crazily. The surrounding spacetime began to gradually distort and change under the increase of his aura, forming all kinds of unbelievable chaos. Some spacetime even collapsed and shattered due to the pressure of his aura. All the fragments flew everywhere, causing this place to become more and more chaotic. As he raised his aura, the other third-grade monarchs also gradually raised their auras. Every single one of them had an indifferent expression on their faces. As the energy in their bodies surged, it produced all sorts of strange phenomena. These phenomena transcended spacetime. Even the chaotic spacetime in this area couldn't conceal these phenomena at all. Instead, these phenomena continued to appear and completely covered the spacetime in this area. It made all living beings in this area feel as if a storm was coming. Fellow Taoists, please wait. Seeing this scene, the Realm Emperor smiled and said, "What else do you have to say?" The level 3 emperor who spoke just now said. The Realm Emperor said faintly, "Fellow Taoists, did you not notice that one Taoist is not here?" When the level 3 emperors heard this, they fell silent. How could they not notice that one of the supreme emperors was missing? Could it be that Taoist Luo Huang also planned this together with fellow Taoists? Another level 3 emperor frowned and said. The Realm Emperor only shook his head and said, "Of course not. If Taoist Luo Huang was willing to help, why isn't he here now? It's precisely because he didn't help that he's not here now. Since Taoist Luo Huang isn't participating in this matter, then what else do you have to rely on? Who dares to challenge all of us?" The Realm Emperor who spoke first said. Hearing this, the Realm Emperor smiled and said, "Since Taoist Luo Huang didn't help and didn't come to denounce us like all of you did, and I treated Taoist Luo Huang's connate inextinguishable spiritual light like all of you. What's his attitude? Don't tell me you don't know? This made all the level 3 emperors at the scene fall into silence. Amidst this silence, their auras unknowingly retracted. The various phenomena caused by the spread of their auras started to gradually disappear at this moment. The fear of the end of the world that was oppressed in the hearts of all living beings due to the existence of this phenomenon also gradually subsided at this time. The heaven and earth gradually returned to normal. Seeing this, the Realm Emperor heaved a sigh of relief. Although he had always acted as if he wasn't worried about the many level 3 emperors, in reality, he was still quite nervous. After all, there were more than 20 level 3 emperors. If they really caused trouble, although he didn't have to worry that they would hurt him, the aftermath of the battle would definitely cause great changes to this heaven and earth. It might even cause the heaven and earth to be destroyed. Under such circumstances, he naturally didn't want to see this kind of conflict occur. Now that he could use Luo Fan to make them stop, it was naturally the best thing that could happen. So what if that's the case? A level 3 emperor said. Although they had already taken Luo Fan's attitude into consideration, they still weren't willing to be schemed against by the Realm Emperor. However, they were still unwilling to be tricked by the World Monarch, unwilling to let the World Monarch take action against their innate inextinguishable spirit light. Fellow Taoists, why don't you listen to what I have to say first? The Realm Emperor smiled. As he said this, the fluctuations of the celestial and human scriptures continued to take effect. They continued to fuse the passageway that connected the connate inextinguishable spiritual light with a certain spacetime, gradually changing that spacetime. The profundities contained in the connate inextinguishable spiritual light were unknowingly fused into everything in that spacetime. This process wouldn't have much of an impact on the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, but it would bring great benefits to this spacetime. Through this change, this spacetime could become a projection of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. If a living being could clearly understand all the principles and profundities within, although it wouldn't be comparable to truly comprehending the principles and profundities of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. However, it would definitely be able to obtain great benefits. It wouldn't be much of a problem to become a supreme emperor. As for the Realm Emperor's actions, everyone saw this and felt even more dissatisfied. Fellow Taoist, it's better for you to stop first. Otherwise, there's no need to say any more. A level 3 emperor finally couldn't help but say this. Hearing this, the Realm Emperor shook his head and smiled. It's not me who's taking action now, it's the celestial and human scriptures. So, sorry, I can't stop at all. Hearing this, the more than 20 level 3 emperors naturally weren't willing to accept it. They sneered and poured their consciousness into the celestial and human scriptures to sense their imprint. They tried their best to control the celestial and human scriptures. However, this time, the Realm Emperor was actually speaking the truth. The celestial and human scriptures had actually become one, and the way they operated could no longer be changed. No matter how they tried to stop it, they could only continue to release that kind of fluctuation and construct the channel. They continued to integrate the principles and profundities of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light into the spacetime through the channel, causing the spacetime to undergo all sorts of mysterious and subtle changes. How is this possible? This situation caused the level 3 emperors to have looks of disbelief on their faces. That's the truth. In fact, although I'm doing this out of my own will, it's mostly due to the requirements of the world. The Realm Emperor smiled. At this moment, he seemed extremely relaxed. In fact, the current changes weren't as he said. It was more due to the requirements of the world. Instead, it was more due to his own requirements. Although the world had this kind of tendency and inclination, it was only a small part of it. Now that the level 3 emperors couldn't control the celestial and human scriptures, he was the one who took action. He took advantage of the time before the crowd started to move. Using the inclination of the world itself, he triggered the great Tao of the world, allowing the great Tao to control the celestial and human scriptures. Then, it replaced his control, allowing him to escape. He didn't need to rely on his own will to activate the celestial and human scriptures to establish the channel and change the spacetime. At the same time, with this method, unless the other supreme emperors were able to transcend the world, they wouldn't be able to seize the authority to activate the celestial and human scriptures from the control of the great Tao. After these level 3 emperors activated the celestial and human scriptures for a while, some level 3 emperors finally reacted and stopped. They looked at the realm emperor with incomparable anger. As expected of the most experienced level 3 emperors, "Your methods are superb. We were actually played in the palm of your hand." A level 3 emperor's mocked. Hearing this, the realm emperor smiled bitterly and said, "Fellow Taoists, don't you know why I did this? The goal isn't an excuse for the method," another level 3 emperor said coldly. Since a third-grade martial emperor was able to refine the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, then his own wisdom and methods would naturally be extraordinary. Anyone who raised a topic, naturally they would know what was going on. Since the level 3 emperors had already explained the matter, how could they not know what the truth was? At this moment, every level 3 emperors looked at the realm emperor with incomparable hatred. If fellow Taoist had spoken nicely to us, how could we not have agreed? You shouldn't have used such a method to deceive us and fool us. The level 3 emperors who spoke first said indifferently, "Ha ha ha!" The realm emperor suddenly laughed loudly. His laughter was filled with inexplicable sarcasm. Fellow Taoists, please do not speak carelessly here. Fellow Taoists, please ask yourselves, could it be that all of you would really agree if I were to speak nicely and discuss with all of you? The world emperor laughed for a while before stopping and speaking faintly. The divine light shining from his eyes seemed to be able to see through everything. These level 3 emperors were seen by his eyes. Suddenly, an inexplicable sense of shame welled up in his heart. Just as the realm emperor said, even if the realm emperor had spoken nicely to them, the possibility of them agreeing was no more than 10%. After all, this was connecting their innate inextinguishable spirit light to heaven and earth. Although, normally speaking, only some of the principles and mysteries of the innate inextinguishable spirit light were inserted into these spacetimes, not a part of the real innate inextinguishable spirit light. However, the passage had already been established. If a cultivator cultivated in these spacetimes and comprehended the essence, he might be able to transcend the essence of the passage and enter their innate inextinguishable spirit light. At that time, although they would still have an absolute advantage, their own authority over the innate inextinguishable spirit light would not change. However, those cultivators might also have a part of the authority over the innate inextinguishable spirit light. Even if it was insignificant, it was still a share of their most precious thing. Under such circumstances, how could they agree to it after just a few words of negotiation? Under normal circumstances, they would probably have to go through a battle and finally rely on the realm emperor's powerful strength to suppress them. Only then would they be able to establish the passage. After hearing the realm emperor's words, many level 3 emperors could no longer blame him with a strong sense of righteousness. For a moment, the scene fell into an extremely depressing atmosphere. Looking at this scene, the realm emperor finally heaved a sigh of relief. Although it was still oppressive, it was much better than the previous scene of a storm. The possibility of a tragic battle was also much smaller than before. This had already achieved his goal. Immediately, he smiled and said, "Fellow Taoists, please don't think that I have selfish motives. I've also contributed my innate inextinguishable spirit light." His words shocked all the level 3 emperors present. They carefully sensed and found that these fluctuating passages were also connected to the realm emperor's inextinguishable spirit light. Looking at the passage, It was not much different from the passage connected to their innate inextinguishable spirit light. Chapter 1750. The Realm Emperor heaved a sigh of relief after the Level 3 Emperors left. Fortunately, the Luo Emperor didn't hold it against me. Otherwise, things would have gotten out of hand. Such a thought flashed through his mind. Thinking about it, he couldn't help but feel curious. Why didn't the Luo Emperor come and hold it against me? I thought there would at least be a fight. He looked at the fluctuating passage that led to Luo Fan's connate inextinguishable spiritual light. However, that passageway was so stable that it was even more stable than the other 20 or so passageways. It looked as though the connate inextinguishable spiritual light was ownerless. However, this situation was clearly impossible. Back then, during the great calamity of heaven and earth, how Luo Fan manipulated the connate inextinguishable spiritual light and used its power to protect himself and the other false sages and desperados was still vivid in the Realm Emperor's mind. If the connate inextinguishable spiritual light was ownerless, how could he have done this? While he was puzzled, the Realm Emperor focused his gaze and looked directly at where Luo Fan was through the perspective of the Heavenly Book and the Human Book, tracing back to the connate inextinguishable spiritual light that was like a long river. At this moment, an inexplicable fluctuation erupted from the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. With a slight tremor, it directly cut off the fluctuation transmitted by the Heavenly Book and the Human Book and disappeared from the Realm Emperor's senses. Even the fluctuating passage that the Realm Emperor had constructed with the help of the Heavenly Book and the Human Book was completely cut off at this moment, as though it had never appeared. What's going on? The Realm Emperor was shocked at this moment. If his vision was cut off, he could still understand. After all, there wasn't much difference between him and Luo Fan. His senses and vision weren't secrets to Luo Fan. If he wanted to cut off his words, it wasn't difficult. However, at this moment, the other Level 3 Emperors couldn't do anything about it. The fluctuation passage that was completely controlled by the great Tao of heaven and earth was cut off. This was beyond his understanding. How could this happen? The World Emperor's expression became extremely serious. Now, although the space-time that was connected to Luo Fan's innate inextinguishable spiritual light had not truly reached a perfect state, it could be considered to be barely complete. The mystery of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light contained in it had also reached a level that could allow those false sages or people in despair to grow into the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. From this point of view, the existence or not of the wave channel was meaningless. Luo Fan cut it off, regarding the Realm Emperor's original plan. But it didn't have much of an impact. However, things obviously couldn't be settled like this. The Realm Emperor originally thought that no one could cut the passageway, but it was so easily cut at this time. What did this mean? This meant that the other party was countless times stronger than a World Emperor. This meant that the World Emperor was simply a frog at the bottom of a well in front of the other party. This was something that even a Supreme Emperor would not be willing to accept, let alone the World Emperor, who had been in this world for the longest time. He was the most experienced third-grade emperor. At this moment, his expression had already become extremely ugly. Suddenly, he somewhat understood how those third-grade emperors felt when they immediately changed their attitude after hearing about Luo Fan's attitude. That kind of helplessness, that kind of unhappiness simply filled his soul. If it wasn't for his strong willpower to control and suppress all of this, he would have long been swallowed by the irritation and jealousy in his heart and directly listed Luo Fan as his enemy. Taking a deep breath, the World Emperor's expression gradually relaxed. After a while, he let out a long breath and murmured, "I originally thought that this kind of thing would never happen to me again, but I didn't expect that after so many years. I actually feel this sense of helplessness again." Sighing, the World Emperor shook his head. He lifted his foot and took a step forward, his figure directly disappearing from this chaotic space-time. He directly came to another place in this world. The place he had arrived at was not his own cave mansion, nor was it his innate inextinguishable spiritual light, but the location of the spiritual mountain where Luo Fan was located. At this moment, there didn't seem to be any difference from before. It was still the same spiritual mountain surpassing boundary, but the World Emperor could directly see that this spiritual mountain surpassing boundary had been divided into many layers. In the depths of the layers of space-time, there was a space-time that formed an extremely perfect and powerful world. In that world, there was a long river that didn't end or end. That was the innate inextinguishable spiritual light on the long river. There was a book that flickered with an indescribable light. The light that it brought possessed an indescribable power. Although it didn't penetrate the space-time, the World Emperor could clearly sense the unimaginable power contained within it. It was the power that belonged to the great Tao of this world. If that power was leaked, then even with his strength, he would probably be sealed for a long time. Compared to this light, what was the effect of him controlling the heavenly book and the human book? Just as the Realm King was about to continue watching, he discovered that an inexplicable fluctuation had swept past him. His vision and his senses had been swept clean in the blink of an eye. Everything in that space-time had completely broken away from his vision and senses. Is this the Luo Emperor's method, or is it a power that naturally leaked out during his cultivation? The World Emperor sensed all of this with an inquisitive look on his face. If it was Luo Fan's method, then it wouldn't make sense. After all, he was already here. If it was Luo Fan's method, then it meant that Luo Fan knew that he was here. His previous probing could even be considered as a greeting. Normally speaking, Luo Fan should have directly come out to communicate with him. Therefore, after thinking about it, the World Emperor was finally sure that this change was definitely a power that naturally leaked out during Luo Fan's cultivation, and after confirming this, the World Emperor's face became even more unsightly. It must be known that once this was confirmed, it meant that Luo Fan would be able to reveal traces of his power even during the process of his cultivation. It was enough to make him helpless with a slight thought. The World Emperor didn't continue to stay here. He lifted his foot and took a light step, his figure directly crossing the yin and yang boundary. He directly came to the underworld. When he arrived here, he immediately saw Guai Shou, who was sitting cross-legged in the endless space-time. At this moment Guai Shou, the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's Brush were floating above his head. After a series of transformations, the imprints of the other supreme sovereigns in the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's Brush had completely disappeared. Now only Guai Shou's imprint was left. Therefore, at this moment, even the World Emperor couldn't control the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's Brush. He couldn't even use these two treasures to sense anything. At this moment, although Guai Shou was floating in the void, the two treasures naturally emitted a treasure light, forming a faintly discernible palace complex around his body. Moreover, within the palace complex, one could even see all kinds of strange creatures moving about. Although those creatures' appearances were extremely strange, they corresponded to all the space-time in the underworld, corresponding to all the creatures in that space-time. This kind of correspondence effect was extremely mysterious and unbelievable. It was a correspondence that couldn't be described with words. At this moment, the treasure light slightly shook. Guai Shou, who was originally sitting cross-legged with his eyes closed, opened his eyes. He looked towards the World Emperor. So it's Taoist World Emperor. I wonder why you're not cultivating in your cave abode, but coming to this eerie place of mine? Guai Shou stood up. He smiled faintly and said, Taoist Luo must be joking. How can such a quiet place be eerie and eerie? The World Emperor heard and laughed. This time, I came to find Taoist Luo Huang. However, Taoist Luo Huang is currently isolated from the world and I can't contact him at all. I wonder if Taoist Luo Huang has a way? The World Emperor didn't beat around the bush and directly stated his intention of coming. Gui Shou couldn't help but be curious. He said, "Master is currently isolated from the world?" This situation was completely out of his expectations. After all this time, although Luo Fan usually didn't pay much attention to him, he usually opened his door. Any cultivator who wanted to go could contact him. Now that he was actually isolated from the world emperor actually couldn't contact him? He thought for a moment and said, "I don't know about this. Let me sense it." At this moment, the world emperor had already arrived in front of Gui Shou. He looked up, and the countless space-time in the entire underworld was already included in his senses. There might not have been anything special about this place in the past. It was just an extremely ordinary void in the underworld. However, as the great tribulation of heaven and earth descended, as Gui Shou cultivated here, and as Luo Fan stood here, this place had already become extremely mysterious. It was almost the highest place in the underworld. With a glance, everything about Sheng in the space-time in the underworld was reflected in his eyes. With a thought, he understood everything. Moreover, he vaguely didn't even need to use any of his own power. It seemed like everything could change with just a thought of his. What a wonderful change! The world emperor sighed inwardly. At this moment, he once again felt what it meant to change the sea into mulberry field. In the past, a seemingly extremely weak living being was barely treated as an equal during the great tribulation of heaven and earth. It was only because of the special circumstances before the great tribulation of heaven and earth arrived. Now, that living being had grasped power that was on par with him. At this moment, when he came here, he actually felt an inexplicable pressure from the bottom of his heart. This situation was clearly a shocking change to him. Yet, this change had only happened in a short span of tens of millions of years. How could he not feel that things remained the same, but people had changed? At this moment, Gui Shou didn't feel as emotional as the world emperor. Instead, he was using his body and mind to sense Luo Fan and contact Luo Fan. However, the senses and connections that he had tried countless times in the past were like stones sinking into the ocean at this moment. No matter what thoughts or senses he sent over, he didn't receive any response at all. It was as if Luo Fan had never appeared anywhere in this world. It was as if such a supreme emperor didn't exist at all. After trying dozens of times, Gui Shou finally couldn't help but exclaim, "How is this possible?" He opened his eyes. There was an inexplicable panic in his eyes as he said, "I can't contact Master at all." "Fellow Taoist, don't worry. Fellow Taoist Luo Huang is still in his cave abode. I can be sure of this. Even if I can't contact him now, it might not necessarily be because something happened to him. Perhaps it's because he's devoted to cultivation and has completely ignored everything in the outside world." The world emperor hurriedly comforted him. However, although his words were comforting, he still felt relieved in his heart. After all, even an existence like Gui Shou, who called Luo Fan his master, couldn't contact Luo Fan. Then, if he couldn't contact Luo Fan, his own senses would be cut off by Luo Fan. However, it wasn't something that he couldn't accept. Perhaps we should ask Qing Yi and Yuji. They're living beings that Master directly enlightened, so their connection with Master is closer than mine. Perhaps they can contact Master, Gui Shou said directly. The world emperor frowned when he heard this, and he said, "Even though it's like that, if fellow Taoist Luo Huang is taking the initiative to sever all connections to concentrate on his cultivation, then wouldn't fellow Taoist Luo Huang be displeased by disturbing him like this?" Gui Shou only shook his head and said, "Whether Master will be dissatisfied or not, I'll do it." His words were full of firmness and determination. It was the kind of attitude where he was ready to risk everything. It really made the world emperor feel inexplicably shocked. It wasn't difficult for Gui Shou to contact Qing Yi and Yuji. Even though Qing Yi and Yuji were hidden in the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, it was still the same. After all, he had worked with them for so many years and had already established an extremely close spiritual connection. Although it wasn't as close as the clone and the main body, and it wasn't as compatible as a husband and wife, a spiritual connection was a spiritual connection. Once the connection was established, it wouldn't be so easy to cut it off. At that moment, Gui Shou's heart moved. An inexplicable thought was directly transmitted to Qing Yi and Yu Ji through that connection. As this thought was transmitted, in just a few dozen breaths, two figures directly crossed the barrier of yin and yang and directly came to the underworld. They appeared on the group of palaces formed by the treasure light around Gui Shou. Gui Shou, what's going on? Why did you suddenly contact us? Don't you know that we're working hard to refine the innate inextinguishable spiritual light? Before seeing the surroundings clearly, Qing Yi frowned and said. After saying this, they saw the World Emperor standing here and quickly came over to greet him. After the greeting, Gui Shou said, I can't contact Master now. Can you contact him? Hearing this, Qing Yi and Yu Ji's expressions changed greatly. If it was something else, they would definitely argue with Gui Shou and teach him a lesson. They would let him know how big of a mistake it was to interrupt their cultivation and make them give up everything to come here. However, when it came to Luo Fan, they instantly let go of everything. There was only an inexplicable nervousness in their hearts. What did you say? What do you mean by you can't contact Master? Yu Ji was shocked. It's what it means. Now, I can't sense Master at all, nor can I contact him. Any communication is like a stone thrown into the sea, as if Master doesn't exist. Gui Shou said. How is that possible? Qing Yi and Yu Ji were both shocked and panicked. You can try. Gui Shou said with a solemn expression. You don't need to say that, we'll try too. Qing Yi said with a somewhat panicked expression. As she spoke, she slowly closed her eyes. Waves after waves of inexplicable fluctuations emitted from her body. They slowly spread out of the underworld through some kind of inexplicable connection and into a certain space-time in the world. However, it was like the connection that Gui Shou had made before. This kind of fluctuation was also like a stone thrown into the sea. There was no response at all. It was as if it was directly sent into nothingness and did not touch anything at all. Yu Ji clearly noticed this at this moment. Her expression changed slightly. Immediately, there was also an inexplicable fluctuation that continuously leaked out of her body. It continuously spread out of the underworld and gradually entered a certain place in the space-time. The same result appeared again. How? How is this possible? After a long time, the two of them murmured and stopped in a daze. Seeing their performance, the World Emperor could not help but feel a little emotional and a little envious. They were already like this because they could not contact Luo Fan. This was enough to show how high the position of Luo Fan was in their hearts. However, Luo Fan had only been in this world for a few tens of millions of years. He had already obtained this kind of love and respect. He did not know how many billions of years he had been in this world, but no one had treated him with this kind of attitude. He sighed slightly. Fellow Taoists, there is no need to be anxious. Perhaps, fellow Taoist Luo Huang is just immersed in cultivation and has no time to care about anything in the outside world. Impossible. Master has never done this before. Even at such an important moment like seizing the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, we were still able to contact Master. Something must have happened to Master. Otherwise, this situation would not have happened. Qing Yi said directly. These words caused the expressions of Yu Ji and Gui Shou, who previously still had some hope, to change slightly. At this moment, the World Emperor could only sigh. At this moment, he already had a vague understanding. Perhaps, it was a mistake for him to come to the underworld this time. Thank you, fellow Taoist, for reminding us. Otherwise, I'm afraid we would not have found out when Master's matter had already reached an irreparable point. Gui Shou bowed to the World Emperor at this moment. When Qing Yi and Yu Ji heard this, they knew what was going on. Although they were anxious and terrified, they still bowed to the World Emperor politely and thanked him. The World Emperor had no choice but to return the greeting. Then, he did not stay for long. Gui Shou and the others were currently focused on what happened to Luo Fan. They did not have the intention to keep the World Emperor, so they did not even ask him to stay. They sent the World Emperor off. After that, Gui Shou's heart moved. The Book of Life and Death and the Judge's brush above his head shook slightly, and all the treasure light around them retracted. In the blink of an eye, only 2 magic treasures were left floating above his head. Next, let's go to Master's place first. Gui Shou said to Qing Yi and Yu Ji. You can't leave the underworld now, right? Qing Yi frowned. Although I can't leave, I can split my body to go there. Although it can't be compared to the full power of my body, it can still exert the power of a level 3 martial emperor. Gui Shou said directly. What about you? Yes. The 2 of you here are only clones. That's good. You can go with these clones. Master gave you 2 connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Your most important task is to refine it. Don't let Master's kindness down. What's more, the 2 of you will only bring insignificant power if you go with your true bodies. I am more than enough, Gui Shou said directly. Qing Yi and Yu Ji shook their heads. Qing Yi said, no need. We don't need our real bodies to refine the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Our clones are enough. Gui Shou wanted to persuade them again, but Qing Yi and Yu Ji's bodies had already collapsed and gradually dispersed. Obviously, the 2 of them had given up on the 2 clones and started to move with their real bodies. Gui Shou sighed slightly, but there was an inexplicable gratification in his eyes. Obviously, even though he knew that their actions were a little irrational emotionally, he was happy with their choice. At that moment, he did not hesitate much. With a thought, his body slowly melted and began to proliferate rapidly. Not long after, he had turned into a ball of liquid that was twice its original size and quietly floated in the original position. Then, this ball of strange liquid slowly separated into 2 halves and began to gradually condense. Not long after, they had already turned into 2 turtle longevity beasts. Both of them were real, and both of them were exuding extremely frightening and powerful auras. At that moment, the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's brush above their heads trembled slightly. They had already arrived at the head of one of the Gui Shou and began to float. Obviously, this was the Gui Shou's real body, the real body that could not leave the underworld. Looking at the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's brush above his head, Gui Shou could not help but feel helpless. He sighed. Although the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's brush brought him great benefits, they also restricted him and deprived him of freedom. After sighing, he slowly closed his eyes. Chapter 1751. Gui Shou arrived at this place for a short while. As the void trembled, Qing Yi and Yu Ji appeared in front of him one after another. Seeing them, Gui Shou's heart couldn't help but tremble. Of course, it wasn't because of their beauty, but because, at this moment, there were traces of innate inextinguishable spiritual light lingering around their bodies. This was a sign that they were going to refine the innate inextinguishable spiritual light and take it for themselves. How could this be possible? He knew very well what kind of existence the innate inextinguishable spiritual light was. It was more mysterious, more complicated, and more profound than the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's brush. Even if it was the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's brush, if it wasn't for Gui Shou's innate luck, he would have to spend hundreds of millions of years just to refine them, let alone fusing them. But now, facing the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, Qing Yi and Yu Ji only spent tens of millions of years to reach this step. They could even use some of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light's power, and showed signs of refining the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. This speed was so fast that he suspected that it was just an illusion. Qing Yi and Yu Ji noticed Gui Shou's eyes and instantly knew what he was thinking. However, at this time, they obviously didn't want to talk nonsense with Gui's show. They didn't explain much either. Qing-yi said, "Back then, Master left behind a lot of comprehension about the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, so we can go straight to our goal without taking any detours. That's why we can reach this step so quickly." Hearing this, Gui Shou suddenly understood. Whatever problem, once it was related to Luo Fan, it was a matter of course, no matter how unbelievable it seemed. Gui Shou could accept it no matter how unimaginable it was. In fact, Qing Yi and Yu Ji showed signs of being able to refine the two connate inextinguishable spirit lights at this moment. The fundamental reason was indeed because of the comprehension that Luo Fan gave them. Don't forget, back then, Luo Fan sold the underworld soil for a good price. All the third-level Emperor's comprehension about the innate inextinguishable spiritual light was given to him by those third-level Emperors. It clearly contained the comprehension of the two natural indestructible spirit lights that Qing Yi and Yu Ji had obtained. And these comprehensions wouldn't have too many immediate effects in Luo Fan's hands. However, when it landed on Qing Yi and Yu Ji, it was like a lighthouse, directly guiding them to follow the most direct and correct path to refine the two innate inextinguishable spiritual lights. That was why things were like this. In just a short span of 10 million years, the two of them had achieved something that normal supreme emperors would need hundreds of millions of years, or even hundreds of trillion years to achieve. Now, let's try to enter that spacetime. I believe that with the power of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, Master should be able to sense it. Yuji said. Gui Shou nodded in agreement. Third-grade emperors were existences of the same level. Thus, they would naturally be on guard against each other. Although Qing Yi and Yu Ji were not rank 3 martial emperors yet, they possessed the power of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. From a certain point of view, he already possessed some of the characteristics of a level 3 emperor. Therefore, they entered that spacetime like this. There was indeed a great possibility that the cave dwelling could attract Luo Fan's attention. It could awaken Luo Fan from his state of ignoring all changes in the outside world. After understanding this, Gui Shou also understood why Qing Yi and Yu Ji had to come here with their real bodies. It must be because only their real bodies could control a part of the power of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. Then let's begin. I only hope that Master is cultivating and nothing happened to him. Qing Yi's face was filled with anxiety. They were quite clear that there were two possibilities for Luo Fan's current situation. The first possibility was that he was cultivating in a way that they couldn't understand. The other possibility was, something happened to him. If he was cultivating and Luo Fan was awakened by them, then it would definitely affect his cultivation. At that time, Luo Fan would definitely teach them a lesson. He might even take their lives. They were quite clear about this. If something happened to Luo Fan, then what they did would obviously be meritorious. They might even be rewarded by Luo Fan. However, at this time, whether it was Gui Shou, Qing Yi or Yu Ji, none of them hoped that something happened to Luo Fan. They were all hoping that Luo Fan was only cultivating. Even if it was very likely that they would be severely punished, they wouldn't change their minds at all. Luo Fan didn't hide much about the cave dwelling. Any supreme emperor would be able to find traces of it. However, it was obviously going to be an extremely difficult task if he wanted to charge in. Unless it was absolutely necessary, no supreme emperor would dare to attack this cave abode. At this moment, Qing Yi and the other two made a decision. One of them moved slightly and directly crossed layers of spacetime. In the blink of an eye, they had already arrived outside the cave dwelling. In the real spacetime, their figures had completely disappeared at this time, and even their faint shadows no longer existed. There was no door in the cave dwelling's spacetime. On its surface, various rules were constructed in an extremely strange and mysterious way, forming an indescribable whole that firmly protected the spacetime. If anyone wanted to enter the spacetime, they would have to completely break through the layers of rules and laws unless they knew the method. The three of them exchanged glances and each took a deep breath. All of a sudden, they raised their hands toward the layers of rules and laws on the surface of the spacetime. Immediately after, as their powers surged, rays of spiritual light gushed out of their bodies and formed one in the void. They turned into a huge palm that slapped the spacetime brazenly and directly came into contact with the rules and laws. Boom! An earth-shattering thunderclap rang out. An incomparably terrifying shock wave was generated, and it began to rapidly explode in all directions. The terrifying shock wave was so shocking that it directly tore the surrounding layers of spacetime apart. It directly blasted the extremely sturdy layers of rules and laws in this part of the world, causing the layers of rules and laws to tremble violently. Circles of ripples began to spread out in all directions from the spacetime. In the blink of an eye, it had already swept through the entire world, although the layers of rules and laws were different from each other. However, even time and space existed according to the rules of the world. Under such circumstances, the distance between the heavens and the earth didn't mean much to the layers of rules and laws. Therefore, the shock wave that directly impacted the layers of rules and laws could sweep through all the spacetime in this part of the world in the blink of an eye, causing all living beings to feel an indescribable pressure from the bottom of their hearts. Some living beings who had lived for a long time and experienced the great tribulation of the world suddenly felt an inexplicable illusion. It was as if the great tribulation of the world had descended once again and the entire world was about to fall into doomsday. For a moment, all kinds of inexplicable fear gradually accumulated in this part of the world. Even the void was vaguely filled with an inexplicable black fog at this moment. The world emperor, who was sitting somewhere between the heavens and earth, sighed. He raised his hand and gently waved it. An inexplicable force instantly swept through the entire world. The subtle killing intent that was born from the fear in the hearts of all living beings was instantly dispelled. The world was restored to its original state of clarity. As the world regained its clarity, the fear and pressure that were born from the hearts of all living beings naturally disappeared. Everything seemed as if nothing had happened. Such a terrifying change had caused the world to undergo such a change. However, the target that Green Wings and the others were aiming for was not even worth mentioning. However, the effect on Luo Fan's cave abode wasn't that great at this moment. The laws and laws above the spacetime in front of them had indeed produced a subtle vibration, creating circles of ripples. However, it was only a ripple. These laws and laws didn't even break, let alone break completely. Master didn't even react to this. The possibility of an accident happening is even greater, Yuji said in panic. Although their attack just now didn't break the laws and laws on the surface of the cave abode, the movement it produced had even caused the entire world to react. It was impossible for Luo Fan, who was in the spacetime, to not feel anything. However, at this moment, he should have felt something, but he didn't react at all. This wasn't normal no matter how he looked at it. That's true. It seems that we need to exert our full strength. Otherwise, it's impossible for Master to wake up. Gui Shou frowned. Originally, he should have been the strongest among the three of them. However, his body was now confined in the underworld, and he couldn't control the power of the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's Brush to enter the Yang world to serve him. Therefore, he was the one who performed the worst here. Both Qing Yi and Yuji, who had mastered a trace of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, performed better than him. This made Gui Shou feel inexplicably disappointed. However, it was obviously not the time for him to feel disappointed. The most important thing now was for the three of them to break the barrier on the surface of the spacetime in front of them, enter that spacetime, and wake up the Master. Immediately, Gui Shou suppressed the disappointment in his heart and gathered all the strength in his body. All kinds of mysterious great Tao runes that he had comprehended from the Book of Life and Death and the judge's brush quickly condensed in front of him. Gradually, they turned into a kind of absolute power and began to slightly wriggle in front of him. After staying in the underworld for so long and comprehending so many mysteries of the Book of Life and Death and the judge's brush, Guizhou finally gained something. Seeing that Guizhou had already taken out his trump card, Qing Yi and Yu Ji no longer hesitated. The two of them looked at each other, and as their hearts trembled, they slowly extracted the trace of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light from their bodies. It slightly wriggled in front of them, and slowly condensed into a hand. Compared to before, they didn't completely control their power now. Although the power that they revealed was terrifying, the three of them couldn't combine their power to form a more perfect whole like before. They could only place it in front of them and work hard to wriggle and compress it, so that the power could increase as much as possible at this time. However, after all, this was already their trump card. At this time, the power that the three of them released was many times stronger than the power that the three of them released together before. Just its appearance, it had already caused the surrounding laws to tremble slightly. It also caused all living beings in the world to feel all kinds of inexplicable pressure. Although this pressure wasn't as strong as the pressure brought by the surging laws when their power exploded. But its essence was even more terrifying, making them even more afraid. Facing such a situation, the World King somewhere in the world finally couldn't stand it anymore. He frowned, raised his hand, and made a grasping motion. In an instant, an invisible palm crossed an infinite distance and directly arrived at the spiritual mountain where Luo Fan had opened his cave abode. It brazenly inserted into the depths of space-time and entered the laws. Crossing layers of space-time barriers, it directly came to the surroundings of Luo Fan's cave abode, and directly covered the entire cave abode, as well as Guizhou and the other two. As this palm covered, all kinds of vibrations and all kinds of pressure caused by the three of them condensing their powerful power were naturally blocked by this invisible palm. Naturally, its influence on the layer of laws was reduced. Although that power was still here, it was still constantly vibrating and constantly pressuring everything around it. But in the end, it could no longer make all living beings in the world feel anything. At this point, the World King's expression suddenly changed slightly. That invisible palm slightly trembled, as if it was about to collapse. Seeing this, he didn't dare to be negligent. With a thought, power surged, and the power contained in that palm rapidly increased. In the blink of an eye, it had completely stabilized. It's just a short period of tens of millions of years, but you've already grown to this step. The World King sighed slightly. Previously, he didn't pay much attention to the innate inextinguishable spiritual light that Qing Yi and the others had mastered. Therefore, when he made his first move, he just casually used his power and didn't display much of its power. But he didn't expect that. Although his attack was casual, it was enough to resist the casual attack of a Grade 3 monarch. It actually couldn't withstand the joint attack of the three of them. This completely overturned his understanding of the three of them. He suddenly and truly felt exactly what level their strength had reached at this moment. He suddenly envied Luo Fan again. Qing Yi and the other two were naturally aware of the changes in their surroundings. He understood the World Emperor's intentions even more clearly. They didn't pay any attention to him. They let out a soft cry and brazenly sent the strongest power they had condensed into the spacetime in front of them. They began to attack the countless laws that were displayed on it. Although they couldn't completely condense their power into one to attack, it didn't mean that the three of them couldn't cooperate. Condensing their power into one was just the highest realm of cooperation, but it didn't mean that they could only use this method to cooperate. At this moment, the place where the three of them attacked vaguely formed a strange array. All the impact and destruction were connected, constantly communicating with each other. As it trembled slightly, it produced all kinds of subtle effects, causing the laws to violently tremble at this moment. The terrifying shockwave once again exploded in all directions. However, this time, the invisible palm of the World King was protecting everything, so the shock wave couldn't spread unscrupulously. In the end, it was limited to the range of the palm. Fortunately, this was the case. Otherwise, even if the shock wave couldn't completely destroy the laws of heaven and earth, it would inevitably cause all kinds of unbearable changes in the laws of heaven and earth. At that time, it was unknown how many living beings would die because of this. Even Qing Yi and the other two found it a little difficult to bear this terrifying shock wave at this moment. His power kept surging as he resisted the terrifying impact that spread out from the point of contact with great difficulty. He protected his body and prevented his body from being destroyed by the impact. However, at this moment, they didn't pay attention to their bodies at all. Their eyes and senses were tightly locked onto the changes in the spacetime in front of them. In their eyes, the laws of heaven and earth seemed to have suddenly become the sea in a storm. They began to change. They began to surge and change, as if there was an invisible hand grabbing the laws and madly pulling them. However, even so, the laws still didn't break. Although the various changes had caused his transformation to be so great, it was still not enough. But once the shockwave spread out, the laws would naturally recover and continue to turn into that strange web to protect the cave dwelling. Seeing this scene, Qing Yi and the other two were filled with respect and anxiety. They were in awe of Luo Fan for actually having such a method to construct this cave abode that allowed them to erupt with all of their powers. It couldn't be destroyed. However, they were anxious because if that was the case, how could they wake up Luo Fan? How could he be sure that something had happened to Luo Fan? The three of them were like this, but the Realm King's expression changed slightly. Compared to the reverent and anxious expressions on the faces of the three of them, the Realm Emperor was only filled with wariness and fear. Originally, he thought that his strength was similar to that of Luo Fan. Although he was a little wary of Luo Fan, he did not fear him. But now, from the appearance of the cave abode before him, he actually discovered something. What Luo Fan could do, he couldn't do at all. Just like the cave abode. Although his cave residence had all kinds of defenses, and those defensive methods were even more complicated than the defensive methods displayed by Luo Fan's cave residence. Exquisite. However, the defense ability of his cave abode couldn't be compared with the strength of Luo Fan's cave abode at this moment. Not to mention anything else. If his cave abode was attacked now, the defense of the cave abode would definitely collapse and be destroyed in an instant. Even the entire cave abode might be destroyed because of it. How could it be like what Luo Fan's cave abode had shown at this moment, with not many changes at all? It seems that I was arrogant before, the Realm Emperor murmured. In his eyes there was fear and inexplicable disappointment. This kind of shock came and went quickly. Very quickly. All the impact had completely subsided, as if nothing had happened at all. What should we do? Yuji frowned. There was inexplicable anxiety in his voice. The attack just now was already the limit of what they could do. Even such an attack couldn't break the cave abode, and couldn't wake up their master. At this time, they were already at their wits' end. Qing Yi and Gui Shou also had inexplicable fear on their faces at this moment. Just as they were about to say something, suddenly, an inexplicable feeling enveloped the three of them. This feeling was so strange and so mysterious. In a trance, they seemed to have returned to the time when they first met Luo Fan. The feeling of facing an incomparably powerful existence, facing an incomparably vast power, completely occupied all their senses in an instant. The supreme divine ability and infinite power that they had cultivated for so many years seemed to have completely disappeared at this moment. A kind of feeling that the other party could easily crush them, but would never do so, arose from their hearts. Along with this feeling, there was an indescribable satisfaction and joy. All the anxiety and fear that had arisen from not being able to wake Luo Fan up had completely disappeared at this moment. Master! In an instant, the three of them murmured at the same time. At this moment, they instinctively knew that this feeling they had now was because of their master's power enveloping them. Why bother? A leisurely sigh came into their ears. This voice they were extremely familiar with, and previously, they even dreamed of hearing it. It was the voice of Luo Fan. Hearing this voice, the three of them instantly turned red, and the joy in their hearts made them unable to speak at all. At this moment, the realm emperor in the distance suddenly had a look of doubt in his eyes. What's going on? What happened over there? Such thoughts flashed through his mind, and his expression constantly changed. Chapter 1752. The World Emperor's expression kept changing. Suddenly, a look of disbelief appeared on his face. I didn't expect him to be stronger than I imagined, he muttered with an inexplicable shock on his face. After all, the World Emperor was a powerful third-grade martial emperor. His thinking ability was naturally strong. Previously, he didn't think about it because of the sudden encounter. Now that he thought about it, he naturally understood that the only person who could cause such a change in his power was Luo Fan. Since Luo Fan could cause such a change, it showed that his power was absolutely weak in front of the other party. He didn't have any ability to resist at all, facing an existence that he thought was on par with him, only to find out that the other party actually had the ability to look down on him. That kind of feeling was so hard to accept. A frog in a well? The World Emperor sighed and shook his head. With a sigh, he turned around and took a step forward. His figure had already returned to his cave residence. Luo Fan was so powerful that he obviously didn't need to deal with any of his matters. Since that was the case, he could naturally focus on his own cultivation to improve his strength. As for what would happen to the power that covered the cave residence, he couldn't be bothered to care about it. Just when the World Emperor returned to his cave residence to cultivate, Gui Shou, Qing Yi, and the other two revealed an incomparably joyful look on their faces. They looked at the slowly changing space-time in front of them expectantly. At this moment, the countless rules on the surface of the space-time were slightly distorted and constantly changing. In the end, a door appeared in front of them. "Come in." A voice that they were extremely familiar with and had been looking forward to recently came into their ears. Hearing this voice, the three of them stepped in without hesitation. In an instant, time flowed and changed. A feeling that all of their power had disappeared and they had returned to the extremely weak state when they were just born reappeared in their hearts at this moment. In this kind of feeling, the surrounding space-time flowed and changed. Unknowingly, they had already arrived in a strange world. Here, an unknown long river traversed the space-time. Above the river, a golden book floated in the air. It seemed like it was not under any control, just existing freely in this space-time according to its nature. In the face of these two existences, the three of them truly felt how weak they were. In their senses, whether it was the book or the river, both of them seemed to have the ability to easily crush them and erase all traces of their existence with the slightest movement. At this moment, Luo Fan's figure emerged in front of them. "Your actions are too rash." Luo Fan sighed when he saw them. "As long as Master is fine." The three of them bowed towards Luo Fan and said. There was no reluctance in their expressions, only indescribable sincerity. Looking at their expressions, Luo Fan's heart warmed slightly. Nodding his head, he said, "I have many comprehensions here. I have no use for them now, so I'll give them to you." Saying, his figure dispersed. Then, from the long river, 3 long rivers rushed out. It poured into the heads of the three of them, instantly penetrating through the barriers of reality and illusion, brazenly crashing into their hearts and merging with them. At this moment, the eyes of the three of them became blank and dazed. There seemed to be endless principles and mysteries flashing in the depths of their eyes. An indescribable aura was constantly emitted from their bodies, gradually shaking the space-time around them, causing all kinds of indescribable changes to occur in the space-time around them. It looked as though there were countless space-time continuously appearing behind their bodies. The moment such changes occurred to them, the outside world that was previously shrouded by Luo Fan's power was completely shrouded. The invisible palm that completely cut off the connection between it and its master completely collapsed at this moment. All the power quickly penetrated the layer of rules and laws, quickly merging into the normal spacetime. It gave birth to all kinds of mysterious things that should not have appeared here in this spirited mountain-surpassing region. All kinds of things decorated the spirited mountain-surpassing region, making this place even more beautiful and mysterious. At this moment, the World King, who was cultivating in his cave abode, felt his power reconnect with himself. At the same time, the scene of the spirited mountain-surpassing region was once again reflected in his eyes through the sensing power. Looking at the spacetime that had not changed at all, the World King sighed slightly. He did not care about how his power dissipated, nor did he care about the changes that would occur to the spirited mountain-surpassing region because of his power. He closed his eyes again and continued to comprehend the innate inextinguishable spirit light that had evolved into a chaotic state. In a certain space-time that was opened up somewhere in this world, a desperator said to another desperator, "I suddenly felt a kind of opportunity guiding me to that battlefield. That battlefield is the battlefield of the Supreme Emperors. If we enter, our lives will not be in our control." The other desperator shook his head. "This is an opportunity. In order to improve, in order to break through, it is necessary to take some risks," the desperator who spoke first said with determination in his eyes. These two desperators were middle-aged. Both of them had an indescribable celestial aura around them, giving off the feeling that they were the embodiment of the legendary celestial aura. "If that's the case, I'll congratulate you in advance." The despair cultivator behind him sighed and said. Hearing this, the desperator who spoke first was not surprised and only said, "Then I shall take my leave." As he spoke, he lifted his foot and left the cave abode without hesitation, quickly heading towards the battlefield caused by the Supreme Emperors fighting for the three innate inextinguishable spirit light. Desperators were already supreme existences above false saints. For such existences, the effect of spacetime on them was extremely insignificant. In just a few breaths, he had already crossed the void and arrived outside the battlefield. At the edge of the chaotic spacetime, there were all kinds of terrifying and dangerous auras in this chaotic spacetime. There were also all kinds of mysterious feelings being transmitted. Therefore, there were countless civilizations built around this spacetime, and there were also countless lifeforms who had adventured in this spacetime. However, although there were many civilizations around this spacetime, the desperators were also the most powerful existences among them. When this desperator arrived, the aura coming from his body shook the surrounding spacetime, causing inexplicable fear to arise in the hearts of countless experts. Countless inexplicable thoughts appeared in the minds of many experts. They kept thinking, what did this desperator want to do by coming here? Did he take a fancy to something in their civilization, or did he see some incredible treasure in the chaotic spacetime? At this time, desperators and false saints arrived one after another around this chaotic spacetime. Although this area was vast in terms of hundreds of millions of light-years, it was only for those who had yet to become false saints. For false saints and desperators, such an area was nothing at all. The moment the second desperator arrived, the first desperator instantly sensed his arrival. The second desperator also clearly sensed the existence of other desperators here. The number of desperators in this world had already exceeded 100,000. In recent years, there had been no major event that required many desperators to gather together. Therefore, between any two desperators, in fact, there was not much contact between them, so they naturally did not know each other. Therefore, these two desperators naturally did not know each other before this. At this moment, after sensing each other, these two desperators barely greeted each other and ignored each other, each starting to deduce the location of their own opportunities. They were deducing how to enter the chaotic space-time in front of them. As more and more desperators and false saints arrived, many desperators and false saints even skipped the procedure of greeting each other. After all the desperators and false saints arrived, sensing the existence of many of their kind, they just hurried to deduce the location of their own opportunities. To find the best way and route to enter the chaotic space-time, after waiting for a few days, the first desperator who arrived finally deduced clearly. Without hesitation, he channeled his energy and stepped into it. His figure constantly shifted and changed between the countless space-time. Occasionally, he would encounter the power left behind by the Supreme Emperor, but he would hide extremely carefully. That way, one would not be able to tell that he was an omnipotent desperator in this world. Instead, he looked like an ordinary weak living being hiding from dangerous creatures in the dangerous jungle. As he entered, more and more desperators and false saints also began to deduce clearly and entered the chaotic space-time. Some desperators and false saints were cautious enough. Although it was slow and difficult, they still reached their destination in the end. The center of the battlefield was also the center of the chaotic space-time, around the more than 20 space-time that had been modified by the World Emperor. However, there were also a large number of people in despair or false saints who were engulfed by the chaotic space-time due to carelessness or other reasons. Their bodies collapsed. Although it was not the kind of destruction where all traces were completely erased, it was still an extremely deep destruction. It would take an extremely long time for them to be reborn. In the end, only 60% of the desperators who had set off were left in the vicinity of these 20 spacetimes. The probability of the false saint surviving was even lower. There was only a 50% chance of surviving and appearing here. Is this my opportunity? The desperator who had set off first looked at the more than 20 spacetime in front of him with an extremely strange expression on his face. This desperator was a desperator who had been born with a Taoism aptitude. His strength was not the strongest among all the despair men, but his cultivation time was definitely the shortest among all the despair men. This person was called Daoist Tianjia, and he was once a false saint in the civilized country before the great calamity of the world. He was also in existence who had met Luofan before. The desperator who had spoken to him previously was also a desperator who had been born with a Taoism aptitude and was his good friend. However, that good friend of his didn't have much ambition. Now, he seemed to have been defeated by despair and no longer had much interest in cultivation. He believed that he could sense the opportunity. His good friend should be able to sense it too. However, he dared to come here. That good friend was not willing to come at all. He was only willing to cultivate quietly in his cave abode and wait quietly. Various thoughts flashed through Daoist Tianjia's mind and he sighed. He lifted his foot and took a step forward, entering the spacetime where he sensed the greatest fortuitous encounter. If the Emperor of the realm came here, he would definitely be able to tell that the spacetime he had chosen was different. It was the spacetime corresponding to Luofan's connate inextinguishable spiritual light. It was also the only spacetime among the 20 spacetimes that was not directly connected to the connate inextinguishable spiritual light through the fluctuation channel. In such a spacetime, one could not directly control a portion of the authority of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light and enter the connate inextinguishable spiritual light by comprehending the various principles and mysteries within it. However, at the same time, compared to other spacetimes, this spacetime also had an advantage. That was, one could comprehend any mysteries and principles in this spacetime. They did not need to be restricted by the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. As long as one comprehended it, they would naturally be able to absorb it without any interference. These advantages and disadvantages added up. Compared to other spacetimes, there was still a significant advantage. After all, it was extremely difficult for any desperate person or false saint to grasp a portion of the authority of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Moreover, apart from this, even if they could grasp it and obtain that authority, that did not mean that they would be free of worries. If you obtained this authority, have you asked the owner of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light? With your little authority, even if you could control a small amount of the power of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, compared to the owner of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, you were still an extremely weak existence. If the other party really wanted to, it would only be a matter of a thought for him to destroy you. Under such circumstances, seizing the authority of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light was obviously extremely difficult and risky, but the rewards were only average. Compared to this, for any desperate person or false saint, it was better to comprehend the space-time corresponding to Luo Fan's connate inextinguishable spiritual light, which had completely cut off the connection with the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. From this, it could be seen that Taoist Tianjia's ability to sense opportunities was much stronger than other false saints and desperate people. Taoist Tianjia crashed into the spacetime. In an instant, spacetime flowed and changed. Countless lights and shadows were continuously born, destroyed, and transformed. The originally complete spacetime suddenly split into endless spacetime and endless worlds in his eyes. These spacetime and these worlds were all extremely complete and perfect. In them, he could even sense that the endless principles and mysteries were resonating with the principles and mysteries that he had mastered, causing his body and mind to shake slightly. This is indeed a supreme opportunity. Looking at the countless spacetime in front of him, Taoist Tianjia had an indescribable joy on his face. However, these spacetimes seem a little familiar. Suddenly, such a thought flashed through his mind. With this thought, he began to carefully distinguish and search for any existence that he felt familiar with great difficulty. As he differentiated and sensed it, he gradually found some of the things he was looking for. This is the Creator. At this moment, his heart trembled, and his eyes were filled with pleasant surprise. Among the endless aura in front of him, the existence that he felt familiar was the same aura that he had felt when he went to visit Luo Fan. Although this feeling was extremely weak, it was definitely there. Could it be that this is the spacetime that the Creator specially opened up for all living beings to comprehend the mysteries of the Great Tao? As this thought flashed through his mind, gratitude and admiration flashed through Taoist Tianjia's eyes. After thinking for a while, he gave up on the pointless thinking and got rid of all the distracting thoughts. His figure directly entered the countless spacetime in front of him and began to change between the countless spacetime, comprehending the countless principles and mysteries that were transmitted from those spacetime. He continuously absorbed the nutrients that he needed from them, allowing his cultivation realm to loosen bit by bit. He began to slowly improve. What was the connate inextinguishable spiritual light? For the vast majority of false saints and desperate ones, that was something extremely distant. Among the many false saints and desperate ones here, there were at most one or two existences who had heard of the existence of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. Therefore, for those living beings, they did not choose to enter the spacetime based on their own understanding of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, let alone the probability of controlling the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. They could only choose based on the place with the strongest opportunities that they could sense in their hearts. In this way, they were like Taoist Tianjia. The number of living beings who chose this spacetime corresponding to Luo Fan's innate inextinguishable spiritual light was the highest among the 20-odd spacetimes. In just a short 100 years, tens of thousands of supreme emperors and hundreds of thousands of false saints had entered this spacetime. The total number of desperate ones and false saints that had entered the other 20-odd spacetimes was not even as many as the spacetime corresponding to Luo Fan's innate inextinguishable spiritual light. Fortunately, this space-time looked small on the outside, but it was extremely vast inside. Any one of the endless space-times could accommodate billions of living beings. That was exactly why. Even with so many false saints and desperate ones entering, this space-time didn't seem crowded at all. In fact, even two false saints and desperate ones would have to meet each other. The probability of that happening was very, very small. Until now, there were less than 100 false saints and desperate ones who had met each other. This was because the space-time corresponding to Luo Fan's innate inextinguishable spiritual light was so popular. However, the mysteries contained in that space-time were being dug out by more and more false saints and desperate ones. A brand new cultivation system that was completely different from all the cultivation systems in the outside world began to be gradually constructed. This cultivation system was extremely mysterious. It combined the cultivation system born from the many spacetimes inside the innate inextinguishable spiritual light and Luo Fan's various understandings of cultivation. Compared to the cultivation system of the outside world, such a cultivation system was more complicated and detailed from a certain point of view. In that spacetime, false saints, however, they were divided into 9 realms. As for desperate ones and supreme emperors, they were divided into 9 realms. They didn't exist at all. In other words, they were included in the 9 realms of the false saint realm. This division of realms, to many false saints and desperate ones, it was a subversion of their understanding. However, this cultivation system's division of realms seemed to be more accurate and credible. In the absence of a supreme emperor coming out to change it, this division of the 9 realms of the false saint realm gradually became the mainstream of the world. Those in despair began to call themselves Level 4 false saints, Level 5 false saints, and Level 6 false saints according to the description of the cultivation system. This form of address even affected the false saints and desperate ones who hadn't entered the corresponding realm of Luo Fan's innate inextinguishable spiritual light. After hundreds of years, there was no longer any division between false saints and desperate ones in this world. All the false saints and desperate ones had changed their minds and followed this increasingly popular division of realms, placing themselves in a certain level of the Level 9 false saint realm. In fact, in the division of the Level 9 false saint, even the Supreme Emperor was included. Among them, the Level 7 false saint corresponded to the Level 1 Supreme Emperor. The Level 8 false saint corresponded to the Level 2 Supreme Emperor. The Level 9 false saint corresponded to the Level 3 Supreme Emperor. However, after all, they were only a cultivation system that appeared between the many false saints and the desperation. To the high and mighty Supreme Emperors, this cultivation system was meaningless. Therefore, this division didn't involve the Supreme Emperors. They were still called Supreme Emperors, and no false saints or desperate ones dared to include the Supreme Emperors in the Level 9 false saint cultivation system.